We'll leave here and take you live to a discussion hosted by Georgetown University looking at how journalism has changed since the Pentagon Papers of 1971 and what the implications are for national security leaks and sources in the digital age. The Washington Post's Bob Woodward will participate in this first panel, and later executive editor of the Post, Martin Barrett. Live coverage on C-SPAN 3.
We have a President Trump who is calling these leaks low-life, un-American, and criminal. And then we have Daniel Ellsberg. Did many of you hear him last night in his speech? Yeah. Calling for more leaks, saying we need more to keep the country and the Constitution secure. We have a superstar panel here to talk about the issues of balancing national security with a free press and how that balance is changing, or Ben might argue whether there's a balance at all at this point. We'll find out. Let me introduce who's here with me. Next to me, a man who I'm sure you are all familiar with, Bob Woodward, who is the investigative journalist with the Washington Post, deeply involved, as you all know, with Watergate coverage and much more. Next to him is Benjamin Powell, now a partner at Wilmer Hale. He was general counsel at the Director of National Intelligence Officer under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And finally, on the end, another very familiar name, David Sanger. David, thanks for joining us. David is the national security correspondent for the New York Times. I'd like to talk about the here and now. Leak seems the inappropriate word. It seems like a deluge of information coming out of this administration right now. And if we put aside for a minute the massive dumps of information, the Pentagon Papers, Snowden, Chelsea Manning, I'm wondering, Bob and David, if you have ever seen this volume of leaks coming out in an administration. Is it unprecedented or not? Bob?
Well, I wouldn't use the word leaks. I think it's aggressive reporting, and it's the transfer of administrations that has created the environment, and a good deal of this is coming from former people. But I agree with Ellsberg, more leaks. But I think David would agree on this. There's this sense that reporters just sit around waiting for somebody to bring in a grocery cart of documents like Ellsberg did, or to call. And I think the best sources are not volunteers, somebody who comes to us, but people we recruit and go to and say, we want to understand what's going on.
Sounds like spycraft.
Well, no, it's reporting, and it's quite basic. And there's a lot that seems to be coming out. I think, as is always the case, there's so much more that we don't know about. The whole General Flynn issue, where he came and now is departed. I think you could probably spend part of your life trying to untangle what really is going on there. So many of the issues we don't know, and we don't know the answers to a lot of the key questions.
Do you think we're going to get those answers eventually?
As Ben Bradley, the former editor of the Post, used to say, the truth emerges. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it comes out rather quickly, but I think there should be a kind of repertorial patience in all of this.
David, have you seen anything like this? And what do you think's behind it? Do you think it is politics? Do you think it's fame? Do you think it's fear? What is it?
I think first of all, it's highly unusual to see this early in an administration. I mean, usually when leaking, you have to assume that whenever there's a transition, the people who come into an administration have come out of the campaign. They believe that their candidate, the new president, walks on water at any moment, and loyalty is sort of at its highest. So I haven't covered as many administrations as Bob has. I didn't mean that as an age issue. It's just,
I talked to some students recently, and one of them said, "What was Calvin Coolidge like?"
It was the time that Coolidge met you in that parking garage. I thought it was really great.
They didn't even have parking garages. I'm not sure they had cars.
But it's been my experience since I got back from a happy life as a foreign correspondent and entered into a 3-year assignment to Washington that is now stretched to 22 or 23, that usually administrations begin leaking after the first crew is kind of gone, and a group has come in to sort of undo whatever damage the initial crew did and wants to explain to you how much more brilliant they are than the people that they replaced. And that process usually takes about 3 years into an administration. We've gotten this starting in week 1, 2, and 3, and I think that reflects a different phenomenon that's underway here. First, the executive orders, which were really the first things to leak, the first big things to leak, were put together by a very small group of people who did not consult broadly, and because they didn't consult broadly, they made a lot of early mistakes. So we saw in the immigration executive order that nobody had thought about green card holders, and nobody had thought about long-term visa holders, and nobody thought about the promises we made to interpreters in Iraq and so forth. And then there was an order, which we still haven't seen, on detention that called for reopening the black site interrogation centers, as if there are countries around the world that are yearning to get our black site detention centers reopened. And I think those leaks were intended to go act as a warning sign to other members of the Trump administration who may not have seen the early drafts, to say, hey, you're about to go walk off a cliff, and you better read these drafts. And in fact, when second and third versions of them leaked, they were missing the black sites and so forth. So I think part of this was to create a new circulatory system because the old circulatory system wasn't working. So that's group one. The second set of leaks, I think, that you have seen have been just about the inner turmoil within the administration. And I think that is in part because you are watching a group of professional people who have been through these transitions before in our career, who know what things are supposed to be operating like at this point in time, and recognize that that process has fallen apart. And if you want to look at the prime example of this right now, look at the National Security Council. Having just gotten rid of General Flynn, and I agree completely with Bob that there's a lot that we don't understand yet about that, the NSC is basically going back to day one. At this point, you've got to, actually before day one, they're going to have to go create themselves as if you were starting the transition. Now, that may be okay if we run on autopilot as long as nothing goes wrong between now and the time that they all come together. What are the chances of that, just given the pace of events around the world? So I think the second set of leaks is sort of a warning that things have got to get together.
You keep saying leaks, though.
And you're right. They are. Bob is absolutely right. These are not coming to us. These are, we're going at. The executive orders might be slightly different. I think those flowed out. Everything else we're discussing is coming out of hard reporting.
Are you concerned at all about this, Ben? As someone from the national security side?
It's a bit of a vicious cycle because what is the reaction when you see drafts published, when you see them leak? Well, the reaction is not necessarily, okay, well, let's make sure we're consulting broadly and widely and sharing these to get input. Often the reaction is, let's draw the circle even tighter, which then has the negative effect, of course, of not being able to consult more broadly. So it is not as if it is an unalloyed good, because often the reaction, of course, is people go further and further into the bunker and say, everyone's going to leak every draft that I'm going to put out there, so we'll only do it among us 3 people here, and we'll dribble it out. And I saw that in 2009 with some of the executive orders that were happening then, where there was kind of last minute coordination, and those of us who were in the intelligence community, called up and said, I know you're going to sign this in an hour, but let me tell you what the impacts are going to be if you sign this in the next hour. And then there's always that scramble to fix things. So it is not as if the reaction, having observed this many times, is, okay, let's do this more broadly. Oftentimes it causes people to go further into the bunker. Because if you do it, if you go through the whole process and there's this feeling then in the White House that everything that we give to the interagency is going to go straight to the press, it just makes it more difficult and gives you more of that bunker mentality sometimes.
But this, what's going on is not about executive orders. What at bottom it is, I think, is about the power of the presidency. And is it functioning? There is this, now the first month into the Trump administration, people are, mostly opinion columnists are writing, it's kind of over, you can't put it back together. And I suspect when the history of the Trump administration is written, this first month is not going to be that important. The president has extraordinary powers. And David and Van know this so well. A president can do all kinds of things and is going to be measured by what they do. And in the national security area, the president can really start a war, legally. I remember talking to a group of academics some time ago in the George W. Bush administration, and they said, well, no, the Constitution says Congress will declare war. The last declared war was when? World War II.
Yeah.
And I think we've had a few since then that are undeclared, and they were just kind of literally reading the Constitution, and I said, look, George Bush can invade Mexico tomorrow if he wants. And somebody stood up in the back and said, don't give him any ideas. But the president can employ the force as he sees fit. The only thing Congress can do is take away the money. And once the troops are out there, and if it is a reasonable military excursion, Congress is not going to take away the money. So I'm interested in what Trump is going to do as president. That's going to be the measure. And all of this hand-wringing, the first month has not been great, but what are those key decisions in the areas that are real serious national security, not things on paper?
David, you wanted to jump in?
Sure. First of all, I think Bob's right that the first month will not be seen as terribly important unless it portends a continued sort of level of chaos. If he gets it together in the next 6 months, everybody will sort of forgive a first month of chaos or forget about. If he doesn't, it will end up looking like they got off on the wrong foot and didn't get back on. What strikes me as interesting in covering this administration is it has not been a straight line in many ways. There's been nothing linear about covering these folks. There are some things that they have done spectacularly badly, and we've just run through a list. And then every once in a while, they've executed something in the traditional way. So let me give you two examples. The Supreme Court nomination, no matter what you think of the nominee, he's eminently qualified. They rolled it out well. They
coordinated
were organized.
with the Hill.
They coordinated with everybody. It was sort of the model of, how you used to go do this. And it was George Bush who was usually pretty orderly about these things, that when he tried to nominate his own in-house White House counsel for the Supreme Court without any of that it collapsed on him. So I think it is worth considering the fact that we have seen moments where they could put it together. What strikes me in the foreign policy arena is that we have gone from what then candidate Trump said to me and Maggie Haberman during our two foreign policy interviews with him about Japan, about South Korea, about China, to what were much more traditional encounters where right off, after saying that he would negotiate on the one China policy, he gave that to Xi Jinping because he recognized that nothing else was going to happen with China if he didn't reaffirm the one China policy. His meeting with the Japanese prime minister was as boring and uneventful as every other past meeting with Japanese prime ministers. And you wouldn't have bet on that based on what he had said.
Except for that little meeting out on the patio at Mar-a-Lago.
Right, and that came out of a North Korean launch, and it came out of the fact that they were trying to figure out, was this a intermediate range launch they didn't have to worry about, or was this the ICBM that we've all been waiting for? And once they came to the conclusion that it was the intermediate launch, they went back to having dinner with everybody else who was having at Mar-a-Lago. I think what they will be measured by is their first big test. So when you think back to the Bush administration, back the days when I was a White House correspondent, the first 9 months of George Bush's administration was about sort of everything and nothing. And then 9/11 happened, and it became the sort of clarifying moment that defined what kind of president he would be.
And defined, in fact, this whole century.
That's right.
Almost everything that's happened is connected to 9/11.
Absolutely, including the movement of counterterrorism to the center of American foreign policy, which it was in the Bush administration. We saw Barack Obama try to move away from that, and I think he did so somewhat successfully. And we are seeing President Trump try to move it back to the center again.
Do you think that it's going to be tougher and tougher to get information out of this administration, both because of the tightening circle that Ben mentioned, and also perhaps because some of that professional class that you mentioned, David, will be leaving this administration, perhaps of their own choice, perhaps not of their choice?
You know, I think it depends on whether or not the president figures out how to make good use of the professionals in the bureaucracy around him.
Well, word this morning that a lot of the professionals at the State Department, for instance, have just been told to pack their bags.
Right, the ones on this, I read that the ones on the 7th floor who sort of do the coordination between the secretary and come together. But the fact of the matter is that any president discovers over time that the United States government is a huge enterprise and cannot be run like a small family business. And you have a president who has run a business, you can argue about how successful it has been, but it's been very small and very tight. And I think he's discovering that the techniques that worked so well at the Trump organization do not work here. There was no vast bureaucracy or intelligence community that could go work out another agenda.
But in the real world of reporting, what the headline from the press conference that Trump had yesterday really is where he said he called the Justice Department and said, let's look at these leaks. And again, back to the power of the president and the Justice Department, if they want to go look at leaks, they can really do this with an aggressiveness that there was much criticism of Obama, and David got caught up in this, their effort to try to prosecute and stop leaking, but the power of the FBI to come in and really examine that, if those are the orders, and Trump is right, technically, some of this is illegal. And we would argue it's transparency and it's desirable. And I think generally the press is pretty careful about going through something that may be sensitive. But that may come down on our heads in a real serious way. No, David?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think, while we all noted that the Obama administration did more leak investigations than all previous presidencies that we could find.
By 3 times.
Combined, yes. They did, by and large, stay, with one exception, to investigating suspected sources, and they didn't come after the reporters. And in the case that Bob referenced, which was my reporting on the cyber attacks on the Iranian nuclear program, Operation Olympic Games, they did a vast set of interviews with more than 100 people who they thought were potential sources, but they never did come after the New York Times, its notes, and so forth. I don't know whether...
Which they could do.
Which they could certainly do.
And you would fight it, and maybe you win, maybe you lose, but...
we don't know if the Trump administration is going to adhere by those same rules.
Exactly. And, I mean, Ben knows this so well. The power to do that is awesome, no?
Well, yeah, I mean, there will be, of course, there were rules put in. There's rules governing the issuance of subpoenas to reporters. Those could be changed by the Department of Justice. Those are largely, internal guidelines. It's not a statute. It's not in the Constitution.
Could be changed overnight.
So could be, could be changed. And there are people that's, would probably favor that, particularly in the realm of communications intelligence. That is the one place where there are federal criminal laws that say the leak of communications intelligence that's properly classified is a crime. That is different.
Not just the publication.
Exactly.
Of it. Exactly.
Exactly.
I know one of the subsequent panels is going to get into the legalities. I don't want to delve too deep in there, but it leads me to my next question, which has to do with anonymity. The Washington Post, at least, is using Secure Drop. Is the Times using Secure Drop as well?
We've got a portal within the Times site. You can all find it advertised on our homepage.
In case you have documents you want to pass along.
Right? Into which people can drop things in a secure way. I've never seen sort of anything like that because it runs. I'm in the same school that Bob is in, which is that these things happen by getting out and trying to understand policy and getting people to explain what they're doing or understanding their objections to what is happening. And that's usually how we find these things. But so when the Times came up with the idea of putting in the Secure Drop, which I think the Wall Street Journal has now also done, and so forth, I thought, well, 99% of the stuff you get in there is going to be crazy. And maybe 90% of what you get in there turns out to be crazy. But some of it's pretty interesting. And what you discover is that there is a vast bureaucracy out here that feels an existential threat.
And not just a national security.
Can I ask Ben a question?
Yes.
So I'm somebody in the government, and I come to you now, a private lawyer at Wilmer Hale, right? And I come to you and I say, I have documents and information I want to give the New York Times or the Washington Post. How would you recommend that I do it?
Okay. Well, first I'm going to have to do a conflicts check to see if I can represent you or not. But getting past that, so let's make sure we're differentiating between two things because there's a big difference, right? So there's the drop of things about policy in the environmental area or the vastness of what the federal government does where for whatever reason you're giving things to the press.
That would be unclassified. Normally.
That would be unclassified government information. We're not going to get into the legalities of that or the appropriateness of that.
And I should say that's the vast majority of at least what, I don't see everything that comes into that drop, but that's the vast majority of what does.
So what we're talking about here, though, is let's talk about national security information. And are you dropping classified information?
Yes, I've got a boatload of stuff, and they say you're one of the experts on this, and you're going to say you're conflicted out?
No, but I just want to make sure we get our arrangements in place. So look, as a lawyer, so you're coming to me as a lawyer, so I am certainly going to tell you about the laws that are on the books, right? So there's no, we can talk about what the likelihood of prosecution is. We can talk about what the precedents are.
So you're going to scare me and tell me not to do it.
I am ethically bound to properly advise you that there's a statute about dealing with communications intelligence, dealing with national defense information, and that you could be subject to criminal prosecution.
And so then in the end, I'd say...
You could also lose your clearance.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're not going to be working in the national security community anymore. There could be ramifications to
And
your
so
pension
your
and
bottom
other
line
things.
recommendation would be, don't do it.
Oh, I don't know that it would be a bottom line recommendation, but I'm certainly going to make sure that you have the full facts as a lawyer. But that's what you would expect, right? If you're going to a lawyer and you really want to hear what the possibilities are, I mean, people have gone to jail and are in jail for this right now.
No, people come to lawyers for protection. And I would want you to tell me how to do this in a way. I mean, suppose it's really, I've got something very important to the national interest, and you even looking at it say, this should come out. How can I do that in a protected way, or not?
So you want me to help you to violate 798 and pass communications intelligence, and to use my experience to do it in an anonymous and secure way? Is that
Basically, yeah.
So now I'm before the DC bar for aiding and abetting you. Is that the next step?
So I've gone to the wrong lawyer.
You got it. I think you might have picked the wrong.
So if
wrong
Ellsberg came to you, you would probably talk him out of it.
No. I think there's the kind of advice piece of this, but there is the fact. I mean, any good lawyer, you certainly wouldn't want your client to be surprised when you go and visit them in the Federal Correctional Institute that, hey, you didn't tell me. I thought, I read about these other guys like Ellsberg, and they get to go on panels and be treated as a hero. How come I'm sitting here in 20 years in jail? You didn't tell me that. I thought I was going to get all these awaards and get to appear with Bob Woodward, and now I'm sitting here in jail, and you didn't tell me. I mean, that would be highly. I don't know of any lawyer actually that whoever may advise somebody to go ahead, who would not make them aware of the risks of going ahead. I mean,
and if Bob asked you, what about secure drop? Will that give me anonymity? You're a cyber guy now. Tell us, is it truly fail-safe?
I don't know of anyone who works in the cybersecurity field that would say that any particular method is fail-safe. There's a lot of pieces that go into transmitting documents and other things that are involved. So the fact of the matter is that you would have documents in some fashion, and you would be placing those in the hands of a third party, and you don't know the security of that third party. So relying on the security of one particular method has its own risks.
Ben, you told me over the phone that you thought that the interplay between national security and the press had changed 180 degrees since the Pentagon Papers. Explain what you meant.
Yeah, I would say there was the Pentagon Papers to the era of the internet and the balkanization of the media. So it probably was stable for a long time in terms of a certain number of networks and newspapers that invested in this area, and there were regular discussions when topics would come up. Now, of course, you have just the publication of raw material without any type of responsible reporting on it. You just have what's happened with Wikileaks and Manning, the dumping out hundreds of thousands of pieces of material, names of people who are democracy activists, names of people who have been helpful to the United States. There's been negative consequences to that. So that is very different, I think, in the past, where you would see an article and there may be discussions between the government and the newspaper, and at least some of the more responsible places that would say, if you can show us harm, we're not interested in just putting out the names of sources, the names of technical methods. So let's have a discussion about that. And you've seen that in the past. Now, of course, you have a couple of things. You have the internet, in which people will just dump these things out there. And now you have the widespread solicitation that both have talked about of the material. Come and bring us the material. That's not good reporting. That's, hey, we're like WikiLeaks. Here's our Dropbox. Drop it on in. Give it to us. So you have the newspapers moving towards WikiLeaks type solicitation of classified information, and the fact that you can't have those discussions anymore in a responsible manner and have any confidence that it's going to hold there. And
Even
the
with
newspaper's thinking,
organizations,
like, well,
even with
if we don't
organizations
publish it,
like
somebody else
these?
will.
Okay, but an important question, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is this solicitation with these drop boxes, would that make us participants in a conspiracy to release classified information? In other words, if the Post came to you and said, should we have this drop box? Because I could conceive of a scenario of somebody dropping something in there that's really sensitive, that causes some sort of catastrophe, and the government, particularly the government now, says the Washington Post is complicitous and this is a conspiracy because they have this drop box.
Mm-hmm. I've not seen any legal case like that
What
or
would your
theory on
recommendation be?
You know he's cautious.
Like I said, I don't think I've seen any theory like that to date, or I've certainly not looked at it.
David, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, let me just disagree for a moment that that the media of the kind that Bob and I work for are doing what Wikileaks is doing. Yeah. The collection side may look similar if you've got this Dropbox, although the fact of the matter is most of our reporting is in the traditional way one does reporting. What Wikileaks does is take this material in and then dump it all out. And they dump it all out and have, by and large, unedited, without thinking very much about the motives of the people who dumped it in, and without interpretation. That's not what we do. We may get this material in, and I'm guessing that the vast majority of it never sees the light of day. Some of it may fit into a broader interpretive piece of journalism of the kind that you're expecting the New York Times and the Washington Post and other media organizations that you want to go subscribe to go do. And you know, the example from this actually comes from the WikiLeaks operation on the State Department cables, which I was involved in when we were doing these in 2010, and which we published as a series called State's Secrets. So we had about 250,000 cables that came from WikiLeaks. And we built our own sort of search engine and databases to go sort this through. And in the end, we wrote that series from maybe 150 of the cables. And only then from putting a huge amount of reporting around what we were learning from those cables. And only then from going to the government in what was a fascinating encounter, or a series of encounters with the State Department and the Obama White House, so that we were sure that we weren't publishing when some dissident was going into the Chinese embassy so that they could match it up with their cameras and throw them in jail. I had a moment when I got a call from a very senior official in the US government who said, David, we were getting ready to publish one of the pieces about Gaddafi and Libya, and Gaddafi was still in power. This was about 10 months before he was thrown out of power. This person said to me, you know, David, I didn't know this till 10 minutes ago, but one person mentioned incidentally in the cable, just in passing, has been an asset of the United States, meaning working for the CIA, for years, if not decades. And if Gaddafi sees his name in a cable, he's just going to put him up against the wall and shoot him. And I said, fine. We'll take it out. We got The Guardian to take it out. We even got WikiLeaks to take it out. This was a different era, right? And as far as I can tell, he's still walking around, and that's more than I can say for Mr. Gaddafi.
So does the 24-hour news cycle, this constant churn, constant deadline, does it make it more difficult to give that sort of time to an investigation? Because someone else is going to publish.
It can, because the competitive pressures are out there, and sometimes you just have to go out and say, folks, we need to calm down and slow down and figure out what we have here. And I've been at work on one project for the past 7 or 8 months. It's a little hard to get away with that in this modern churn world. And the churn sometimes slows down the ability to go spend the time on the kind of investigative things that Bob and I and many other journalists like to go do.
And you've got a culture of impatience and speed, which drives the readers and the viewers, and the expectation is Trump has his press conference yesterday, and I found myself going to the New York Times or the Post or other websites. Well, what's the reaction? I want instant reaction.
Twitter's where you go.
Well, I don't even know what that is. I'm sorry. I see Sandy Younger sitting there, who did the great book on the Pentagon Papers and the press, the papers and the papers, wasn't it called?
Yep.
And how really important the Pentagon Papers decision by the Supreme Court was to journalism, and how liberating it was, because in that decision, which was technically a 6-3 decision, but there was a per curiam issued by the court, the Chief Justice Berger, who really dissented, but he read saying, oh no, the press can go ahead and publish the Pentagon Papers. That created an environment. David was mentioning, you're working on something and you go to the government and say, hey, look, we have this, and it may be sensitive and secret, and we want to find out if it's true. We want to put it in context. I think that at least I'm sure David and lots of people would agree that you don't want to publish something that's going to get somebody killed or thrown in jail. So you have to be very careful. So I can think time and time again, going to the 7th floor on the CIA, going to the Oval Office and presenting information that we have. And you can do that knowing you're not going to be arrested, and knowing in a more important way that the government is going to not say, gee, you've got this, we're going to court to stop you from publishing it. So I think it's been, I know it's been liberating to the press. Has it to the government?
Liberating in the sense of being able to engage in those discussions?
Yeah.
Well, of course, it's been helpful to have. I mean, there's been a number of occasions where, you know, those discussions have been helpful. Now, it is, but let's be clear, it's not a joyous and good day when you get the call and they say, we have this information, we'd like to come in and talk to you, like, say, at 3 p.m. today, because we want to publish it at 5 p.m. unless you could sit down and have a discussion. Or so now I have a situation where classified information has been blown. There's a source, there's a program, there's something else that may be very valuable to us. And often the case is you're doing repair around the margins.
Well, you should have found another line of work if you were looking for joyous.
Exactly. So you're making it seem as if we have this discussion and all is worked out and all is fine. What we're doing is often you're trying to minimize the damage, but there is
well, but you're given that opportunity because of the Pentagon Papers decision, don't you think?
Well, why is it that the Pentagon Papers?
Because otherwise we wouldn't walk in the door for fear that we would be walking out in handcuffs. So, you know,
in that sense, yes.
And that's not a joyously good day.
Yeah, that's not a good day.
That's right. So, I mean, there's a reason for this process. And the reason for this process is that if we're walking in there, it's to say, look, we have this story, we think it is important and raises the following big policy concerns for the United States, big moral concerns for the United States, whether it's the wireless, the warrantless wiretapping thing, or whether it's the use of cyber weapons by the United States against another state for the first time and the precedent that it sets. And what we're trying to get at is the concept that you can have a vigorous discussion about the policy implications of a hugely important program for the United States without necessarily blowing the how of how it's done. And you know, the example here really is in nuclear. Most analogies to nuclear weapons don't work, particularly I find, and I write a lot in the cyber field, they don't work in cyber, but one does. We had a very vigorous discussion in this country about how and when we would use nuclear weapons without publishing most of the details of how you build them, who's got authority to go use them, where we keep them, and so forth. Some of that's gotten out over years, but it's been 70 years and it's leaked out over time. That debate turned out to be critically important because United States policy reversed. I mean, MacArthur wanted to use the bomb against the North Koreans and the Chinese. We had some crazy generals who wanted to blow up the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy listened to them and escorted them out the door. We ended up concluding we would only use nuclear weapons as a matter of national survival. Complete opposite from the Eisenhower, it's just another bullet in the arsenal, which we don't even think Eisenhower himself believed. Okay, so we need to have that debate in a range of different areas. Cyber's one of them.
Can I give an example?
Sure,
I mean, just because I think this...
Yeah, sure. I want to get to questions shortly, but go ahead.
Okay, but I mean, real quickly, this was in the first month of the Carter administration, 1977, we learned that King Hussein of Jordan was on the CIA payroll. And so I called Jody Powell, who was the new press secretary for Carter, and I said, understand King Hussein is on the CIA payroll. What's your comment? And the code, I remember vividly, the code word for the operation is no beef. And I remember Powell saying, no shit. And then he did some checking. He said, okay, the president wants to see you and Ben Bradley in the Oval Office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So we went and went through, and Carter said, I want to talk off the record. And Bradley said, fine, but I had my notebook out. And he said, no, you can't even take notes. Okay. And he said off the record that, yes, this is true. They hadn't told him about it. He thought it was wrong to have heads of state on the CIA payroll, and he was going to stop it. And then Ben asked the critical question, if we publish this, will it harm the national security, which ultimately is the measure? And Carter said, no, it won't, but I really don't want you to publish it. Georgia, please do us a favor and don't publish this. And of course, we published it, and he was quite upset that we had. And but he opened that door by saying it's not going to harm the national security. And ultimately, that's the question you're asking when you go to the government, and I think is
That's
no?
right, and sometimes in that conversation, uncomfortable as it may be for you, you work something out. So when I was working on Olympic Games, on the cyber story on Iran, I went to many people in the government. A lot of this has now come out in court papers, so I'm not revealing anything here that hasn't been before. And I said, look, the story's got to be told. And cyber is the first weapon that was developed by the intelligence community, so nobody really wants to talk about it because the intelligence community doesn't. But we've got to air how we're going to use this. If there are techniques that you think are particularly damaging because you're using them right now that I'm describing here, tell me that, and maybe we can figure out a way to word around that so we're not undercutting ongoing operations. And in the end, that's what happened. Now, Snowden, as it turned out, blew a lot of those techniques 9 months later, but we didn't know that at the time.
Ben, do you think they get it right, or do they get it wrong?
Oh, I think this leads one to think that this is a process in which, in all of these occasions, there is a considered and measured approach of the type that's being described by very, very senior and distinguished reporters here. Okay, these same situations, though, and we can then draw a chart and start to have a fight about, well, what about this one? What about this one? The New York Times blew a very important financial program. The article was written in a manner that's suggestive of widespread illegality, turned out to be entirely appropriate based on unclassified subpoenas, no discussion with the government or consideration of the New York Times. This involved the terrorist financial tracking program, widely discussed, entirely appropriate, entirely damaging what was done there.
And as you point out, unclassified.
And that doesn't mean that it was the right thing to do, or that did not have damage, or that the article was written in a way that was entirely suggestive of sinister and illegal activity. It was a number of other that have been discussed and published about in the papers.
You
how
sound a bit defensive about that.
I just think I think we're presenting a situation where, as if in each case, here's the process that's followed, and these are antidotes. But there are, for every one of those, let's not pretend there's not antidotes on the other side, or stories on the other side. I could go down and talk about other things that have been published in terms of technical
What's the
details.
worst, in your knowledge, that was published that caused the most damage to national security?
Oh boy. I'd have to give that one some thought.
While you do that, let's start taking some audience questions. We have one right here. We have a couple of people with microphones. They're going to run a mic to you right here in the second row. Here it comes. And if you could tell us who you are.
Yes, my name is Peter Gluck. There were several references to the Pentagon Papers case in the context of a shield or a protection for media organizations. But that was 45 years ago, and the court has changed so much, not just in terms of the people,
Completely.
but in terms of the ideological distribution of views. So what confidence do you think media organizations should place that the Pentagon Papers decision would continue to protect them today?
I mean, real quick, I mean, the court, it's all the justices, all 9 for the Pentagon Papers decision are dead. And so they're not on the court, believe it or not. So of course it would be different, but the precedent here can change, absolutely. But see, under this, to me, is not a legal argument. That ultimately, if the press is in the position, like I think New York Times and the Post and others were on the Pentagon Papers, that this was in the broad national interest that this be published, and that it actually did not harm national security. It helped national security. And as you point out, Ellsberg is kind of a hero. And so I think we have to proceed with that assumption. The difficulty here is if something gets published, which is so likely that really does harm national security or gets someone killed, then the press is in the position of being on the wrong side of the line. And the Supreme Court, having done a book on this a long time ago, is inclined to look at what is the moral atmosphere, and that doesn't drive the decision. But so it's very important that we be careful, particularly in the Trump administration. But David points out in the case he was involved in, the government was very careful in subpoenaing. You finally got subpoenaed.
No, I never did.
Oh, you never did, didn't you?
Did.
They wanted you to testify voluntarily or something?
They never subpoenaed us.
See, but I mean, that's a kind of sensitivity to the First Amendment that would quite likely not be practiced by the Trump administration. So we need to be careful, as we always have. It's always good to say, when we told the world that King Hussein was on the CIA payroll, I think it did not harm national security, and it was in the context of, you know, what's the CIA doing? What are they up to? What is their mission? What are they trying to accomplish? And Carter's position was it was not right for us to buy heads of state in other countries.
David, do you want to...
Two quick points on this. First, when we published Wikileaks in 2010, there was considerable internal discussion in the Times about whether the government would seek to relitigate the Pentagon Papers case, and we were sort of prepared for the moment. In fact, I think we presented it to the government the Monday before Thanksgiving in 2010, and we knew we were going to publish the following weekend. And the thought had occurred to us that some of the courts might be closed over Thanksgiving. Now, it didn't. We didn't plan it that way, but it was certainly a factor that we thought would be a disincentive. The Obama administration made no effort to go out and do that in the end. Secondly, Bob makes the point that the Pentagon Papers certainly did a huge amount to inform the debate about the Vietnam war. And if you go back and you read the Pentagon Papers today as a history, and you think about the kind of things that have been leaked, whether it's Wikileaks or Snowden today, the Pentagon Papers looks more innocent in some ways because it was backward-looking.
Historical, yeah.
Whereas it was historical material, whereas much of the material that has come out since has been operational to this day and raises, therefore, I think, a different set of issues. This process that we discussed of going to the government, I agree with you. You know, this works when it's the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and AP and others coming in the door who are established journalistic entities, and the White House will come in and have that discussion. Where I think it gets more worrisome is a lot of stuff that just leaks out in over the internet, gets published on the internet by people who either don't have the journalistic standards or wouldn't be able to attract the conversation, you know, to have that conversation at all. And if I was the government, I'd be more worried about that than I would about the Times and the Post and others.
Another question. Right here in the blue.
Hello, thank you for speaking today. My name is Chandra Caldwell. There's a clear distinction that I don't feel is being made, and you alluded to a little bit, Mr. Powell, in the sense of a distinction between revealing information of a dysfunctional White House or Department of Defense and revealing classified information, which is classified not because of the content necessarily of the information, but the sources, means, and methods by which it's collected. And we're seeing a distinction between the Pentagon Papers, which it was a very surgical approach to a singular issue that was felt to be important, compared to a Chelsea Manning or Snowden who is releasing terabytes of information without going through it and surgically taking out information that they deemed should be shared. And the sources, means, and methods that we rely on for our national security are being released to foreign adversarial governments. And it seems like between the talk yesterday and today, that's being conflated a little bit as being equal to each other. And it's setting a dangerous precedence in my mind that you're going to have armchair analysts who are assuming that they should reveal whatever information they have access to because they feel that it's justified. And I'm curious what your response is in the changing environment.
Who wants to tackle that one? Ben?
I thought it was well said. But this is an important distinction. Some of what we're talking about here is exactly kind of bigger policy issues. I do think we're overlooking the fact that much of what we read about today, and frankly since 9/11, has been far more operational and technical details, a fascination with intelligence sources and methods, how terrorists are tracked, how counterterrorism operations are done. And there's no doubt that there's a public interest in many of the programs and other pieces of that that has been discussed in the newspapers. We've had public debates on them. We've had laws that have changed. We've changed collection authorities and really had a very vigorous debate about that. At the same time, though...
And would that have happened without that disclosure, you think? And would we have stopped listening to Angela Merkel's cell phone or closed those black sites had it not been for the revelations?
I'm not going to talk about anyone's cell phone. I don't know what would have happened with the black sites, with or without those revelations. So I do think they would have been closed without those revelations. But that's a longer discussion. But we have had damaging leaks of technical sources and methods, and what you're reading about in the paper is not the Pentagon Papers and what's been kind of our global policy towards the Muslim world. And here's a study from the State Department discussing that, and it's classified because it contains some intelligence in it. We've seen a lot of discussion of, frankly, pure sources and methods of how we carry out operations, how we do sensitive electronic surveillance. And so when you're regularly reading about these things, it does have damage. And it is not just confined to the WikiLeaks of the world.
Okay, but sometimes we don't publish.
Absolutely.
To give an example
Absolutely.
from the Obama administration, going to the CIA with 10 things I had that was going to be in a book Obama's wars, and went through them and listened to their arguments and got to one called the counter-terrorist pursuit teams. The CIA had a secret army in Afghanistan that was under CIA control, the best Afghan fighters, very effective. And I said, I'm putting this in the book. And the CIA position was, oh my God, that's secret. That's the classic secret army. You shouldn't put that in. And I said, well, I'm not going to name any members of it or where they operate from or any operations. No, still you should not publish it. And I said, well, look, there are a lot of people in the Obama administration who say we don't need 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, that this counter-terrorist pursuit team actually does the job, and I think it's relevant. They were not happy, but it was published, no harm. And then I got to another item and mentioned it, and literally the CIA said, if you publish that, we can lose a war. And that got my attention and went through their argument, and it's not in the book. And it's a great story that someday can be told, but you listen and you, it's David's point, you go through, and this is just a much disclosure, more disclosure than the government would like, almost always, because they would say don't publish any of this stuff, but not the sort of thing that will get people killed or cause us to lose a war.
So what's fascinating here about this discussion, though, is it is the reporter who's doing this weighing. So this is just a curious feature of the system that we have.
And it's called democracy.
Well, I'm saying exactly,
right.
exactly. Well,
right.
no, but
that a single citizen can go and the government will listen to that.
Right.
Are
and
you worried about the power that journalists might have, or?
I would be concerned as to whether or not the reporter has the qualifications and the full global picture of you're making decisions on what sources and methods, in your judgment, are going to ultimately harm the national security. You're weighing the government's argument. You're weighing what you think is the public interest. You're weighing your paper's interests. And that power is now in your hands because of information that you've obtained.
And it's called the First Amendment.
Okay, absolutely.
So,
and that's what distinguishes our system. And it can work. I mean, we held for 3 years at the Bush administration's request a story that ultimately we were able to go publish once the program was done about a secret U.S. program to help the Pakistanis secure their nuclear weapons. Yeah. And a convincing argument was made to us by very senior members of the Bush administration that to go publish it at the time that we had the story would be to give the Taliban, you know, arrows into the most vulnerable nuclear sites within Pakistan. And we held it and held it and held it. And finally some set of events came up and I called in and I said, you know, I'm not sure we're going to be able to hold this much longer. They said, oh, you're still holding that story? Oh, you could have run that a year ago. That program's done, okay? I was like, oh, wish I had checked more often. But that said, yes, the distinguishing feature here is that it's the news organizations that make the decision. And that's actually not only what separates our democracy from non-democracies, it's what separates ours from, say, Britain.
right.
Do we have another question?
And you're uncomfortable with that at core.
So what you're saying is that the First Amendment has wiped away the statutes for the protection of classified information. And I'm not saying that I'm uncomfortable. I'm saying we need to recognize, though, that it is, to the extent that the position is that we will do the weighing, and it is our power to do that. That is an awesome power. Yeah. That is an awesome power to decide.
But you have an awesome power with those laws that you can go after someone who releases classified information, right?
Well, I guess we can debate about how awesome those really are in terms of the precedents and those types of things, especially if you take the position that the First Amendment wipes away all those laws.
No, it doesn't wipe them away.
I want to get another question in here. Young man in the third row right here. Or fourth row? Right there.
Thank you all for speaking. I'm Christopher Blair. So far in the discussions, I'm I'm kind of getting the feel that in the court of public opinion, we're kind of delegating the media as the prosecutor. So, and thus, ethically speaking, where does the media draw the line when receiving documents from a potential leaker, and is the intrigue of the story more important than the potential ramifications to imminent or long-standing national security policy or posture?
It's an excellent question, and I hinted at it before about why we have these conversations. Because what we're trying to do is air the issues, the policy questions. Do we as a nation want to have these black sites? Do we want to do bulk collection and so forth without necessarily blowing the operational detail? And that's, you said prosecutor. I don't think that's the case. We can't prosecute anything. We can start a policy discussion. We can make sure that discussion happens. In the end, Congress gave the president and the executive branch many of the powers that President Bush took upon himself in routing around the FISA court. But that happened only after a full discussion about whether or not that was the right way to go. So I think that what we've learned out of all of this, and what we've learned really in the era since the Pentagon Papers, is that it's very important to have that conversation so that we understand that something we're about to publish could cost a life, cost an ongoing operation, cost an imminent operation. And I don't think most people in responsible media want to go do that. But that also means that we have to make a judgment about whether the broader discussion about whether we're heading in the right direction with a set of policies gets aired. And there's a way to go do that. There's a way to go move through that line. Now, the point's been made that in the world of the internet, where everybody's a publisher, not everyone's going to show that judgment. And that's certainly one of the big challenges of our time.
We should also take a position of humility on this. And I think Ben would agree with this, that, for instance, the Wikileaks stuff, which the New York Times had and published in that series, which I thought was very good, but as you know, almost all of that information, and I think maybe all of it, the top classification was secret.
The lowest level.
Yeah. Mid-level anyway, but not the top secret special access program material. And the New York Times editor took the position, we're telling you how government works. Well, that was an excellent series, but it didn't tell you how government worked, because the top secret information is really what informs presidents' decisions. And I remember talking somewhat recently to somebody about Snowden, very controversial figure, and this person who I've known very well said, Snowden didn't have the good stuff. And I think that's true. I think that, we worry about WikiLeaks and secret documents and some of the stuff that Snowden revealed, but the good stuff, the really deep secrets, as President Obama called them, don't get published normally. It's very rare. So we're getting into the government's business and an important part of it, but there's also the deep secrets part that we really don't get into. Is that fair?
I've certainly seen a number of things published in the newspapers, putting aside Snowden, that have been the details of technical operations. So I don't think that the papers stick to just here's how the government works or the policies. I have certainly seen discussions of operational details.
But there
and
also
things.
say there are X number of operations that are really sensitive. It's a very small portion that get published. Is that correct? Or
yeah, boy, I would say that when you publish the technical details have been damaging. I've never looked to see. I mean, when Jim Clapper says only God knows all of the compartments that are out there, it probably is a smaller proportion.
A compartment is a classification in a special access program or SCI program that for where they're limited allegedly to people who have a need to know.
Yeah.
But I still think there are a lot of things we don't know about, and quite frankly, from my point of view, I'd like to know about them, because the government's capacity to do things in secret is immense, and it's really, I think secret government is the thing we should worry about the most of all of the things, and the judge who said it got it right. Democracies die in darkness.
Well, this is a fundamental challenge of having an intelligence community in a democracy, right? I mean, this is the fundamental challenge, that the secrecy can be inconsistent with democracy. And how do you strike that balance?
May you have many joyless days.
Exactly. I'm not there, so I'm fine.
Okay, there's a question way at the back there.
Hi, Gabriela Munoz. I just wanted to go back and talk about WikiLeaks. Basically, over the summer, it was very controversial when WikiLeaks published the DNC emails, Hillary Clinton's emails, John Podesta's emails. How do you guys feel in terms of legality, in terms of trusting of the source, between WikiLeaks and, say, someone leaking from within a government organization or within a campaign? Do you guys feel that WikiLeaks is needed to get the information that sources won't reveal?
Anybody want to?
Well, I'll take a first shot at that. To my mind, the material that was released by WikiLeaks this summer, first about the DNC, and then the second tranche was the John Podesta emails, and there were some others in between, but those were the two high points, were more fascinating to me for what it said about who was trying to act and disrupt an American election than the contents. And the contents of the DNC material was largely infighting within the DNC about support for Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton. I didn't find that to be quite as fascinating as many of the political insiders inside the Democratic committee did. The Podesta emails, again, wasn't full. It had no classified information. There, you got a sense of what Hillary Clinton's speeches to Goldman Sachs were like. They were a lot like speeches I heard her give when she was Secretary of State. There wasn't in there a whole lot that was terribly remarkable. What was remarkable was the fact that there was a channel from Russian intelligence to WikiLeaks, and Russian intelligence distributing this first through some other channels that weren't as successful, weren't as widely read as WikiLeaks, that told us a lot about the Russian operation.
But we didn't know that.
Well,
that early.
We learned it pretty fast,
Yeah,
Bob,
but
because by
was...
July we were writing stories. Remember, the first revelations, the first publication was fairly early July, and by the third week of July, we wrote a story that said that U.S. intelligence had concluded with high confidence that it was the Russians who were behind all of this. The intelligence community came out with that assessment on October 7th. So within a matter of weeks, we pretty well put it together.
Yeah, but it had an ambiguity about it, I thought, and inevitably you're going to go to the content. What's the content of this? And those were legitimate stories. But I agree with you. In retrospect, when you have the much harder conclusion that the intelligence community made, that this was part of an operation to hurt Hillary Clinton, and there was not, over the summer in the campaign, the kind of clarity.
As you said earlier, this reveals itself over time. And,
Yeah.
We had a team that was pretty well just focused on the Russian part of the operation, even while we were reporting the materials from...
Yeah.
I'm curious if anybody's ever tried to punk you. So I come from the world of television, where we always had to be cautious about things that had been photoshopped or otherwise manipulated. Given the fact that video can now be manipulated with great sophistication, audio can be, voices can essentially be reprogrammed to say something different than they originally said, and documents certainly can be edited. Have you ever gotten material that you thought was the real deal and then discovered wasn't? Someone was trying to play you?
I think it's an increasing issue. Fake Twitter accounts,
Yes.
are a significant issue now, and you've really got to slow down and say, there was a moment somebody was faking a Twitter account they had set up for Rex Tillerson, and we were looking at it and thought that he had issued a policy pronouncement until we realized this was an unverified account. Within cyber, a big issue is data manipulation generally, and it's increasingly possible to go do it, and it's something I think we have to be careful of in a way that I'm not sure even 5 years ago was possible.
And I tend to believe in human sources, that if you have somebody who's in a position of knowledge and you have established a relationship of trust, that's so much better. Even going back in the 80s, I remember Bill Casey, the CIA director for Reagan, once saying, it's so much better to have a human source, somebody who sits outside the prime minister's office who will tell you what goes on, than having a bug in the prime minister's office, because you're going to get stacks of transcripts and you don't know what's important. And I think this is the problem with the internet and the things, David, and Twitter accounts and so forth. They're guides, but in the end, what you need is somebody who will really kind of, for good reasons, tell you what's going on. And ultimately, you want to get a cabinet officer or somebody in charge of one of the intelligence agencies or a national security advisor or the president himself or herself who will respond. I, in doing books, would send questions to Presidents Bush, Obama, and just because I had the luxury of time, I can kind of say, these are the 60 things that happened that are important, and what's your comment on them? And they will, in all cases, I have found, engage in that because it comes from human sources, not Twitter accounts.
Questions? There's another one back here towards the back.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a Georgetown student. I was just wondering, do you think that this discussion with the government is going to be possible when they view the media as this opposition party? And if that, especially with the upper echelons of government?
It's a really great question because, every administration has to go through a period where they have to get accustomed to this kind of give and take and ask the question, do we really need to answer these? What are the consequences if we don't answer these kinds of questions, if we don't engage in this conversation? In past administrations, not in this administration yet, it's early yet, I've had people say to me, I'd love to talk to you about whether or not this piece of information would be harmful, but if I had that conversation with you, I'd have to discuss classified material, and I can't, get into that. So every administration's got to work out its own set of procedures for this. It's very possible that this administration, with its rather unique view of what the media is, the opposition, may decide that they're going to engage in a very different way or not engage at all. But I think the danger for us is viewing ourselves as the opposition, instead of viewing ourselves as the people who are sent out to go do a very specific job that's the same job we've done with past administrations, Democratic or Republican.
And of course, the administration won't speak with one voice.
Of course not.
And there are many people out there who you can establish relations with, hopefully, who will explain what's going on. And I think ultimately the media, we have to make as strong an argument as we can for transparency and the benefits of transparency. It's not just that it helps more subscribers for the newspapers or the websites and so forth.
Although that's a nice benefit.
No, but it helps the government. And if you spend enough time with people, I've had so many people in government over the decades say, it was good that got out, that we had a public discussion about it. And initially, often the reaction is one of a seizure or a joyless day. But once things proceed, they'll say, yeah, it's good that we had a discussion of the black sites. That this, I mean, this raised all kinds of governing questions, also all kinds of moral questions that needed to be discussed. And that's one of those stories that served a real purpose. And if you asked President Bush, George W., former president, and had him here on sodium pentothal, truth serum, I think he would acknowledge that, yeah, that was painful, but we needed to have that discussion.
One thing that struck me rereading Sandy's book the other day was that the Post and the Times, although competitors, stood together in a way with the publication of the Pentagon Papers. I'm wondering, in this current environment with the splintering of the media and different points of view, whether you have that unity of effort. You have Breitbart, for instance, right now, although you may not like them, tremendously influential, joining the Trump chorus, decrying leaks to the media. So is the press position weakened because the press is splintered?
It's a really interesting question, because you do have this group of loyalists out there. I think the Times, and I mean, just to watch the Times and the Post in the past couple of weeks, there's been obviously no cooperation between the two groups, but there has been, I think,
common cause.
There has been a remarkable amount of incredibly good journalism done by both organizations, and I think that while I think both organizations remain competitors, and competitors with an ever-widening group of other publications, I think that's been a really good thing.
But you can't work in concert.
You can't work in concert.
But what you can do, and this is, and I agree, this is evident in the last month, when a news organization, whatever it is, has a good story that another news organization is following, there is that line, this first appeared in the New York Times.
Yes.
And there's more and more of that. And I think the distance prevails. People are going to do their own work, but the acknowledgement of a good story, and there have been a lot of good stories, and I think it's that the New York Times is more frequently than the Post had to say, by the way, this appeared in the Washington Post.
I'm staying completely out of this one.
Wise move.
We'll take the scorecard question offline, but I think where the cause is where it's important to have the cause in common is if the government decides to take steps that, in the view of many in this room, would try to restrict free press. And I think on that question, that's where you want to see as much unity as you can, and not just the Times and the Post, but across as much of the journalistic community. Now, in the fractured world we're in, you're not going to see that entirely. And if this administration starts going after reporters or news organizations, my guess is that Breitbart might take a different view of this than the Times and the Post would. But I think that you can be fierce competitors on the news and have a relatively common view of what the fundamental liberties are here.
And the real headline from Trump's press conference in these first 4 months, whatever it has been, he made very clear that he's going after leaks. And he thinks the problem is not the information in the leaks, but the leaks themselves. So I would say keep your seatbelt on. And David, I promise to bring you a sandwich.
Oh, thanks.
In jail.
And in the show of that
Would you
unity,
like to pre-order?
Yeah. In the show of that unity, I too will bring Bob something as long as he emails his choices. Yeah.
Do we have another question? Any hands up out there? Here, over here, we have one. The microphone.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a Georgetown senior. My question is, at President Trump's press conference yesterday, he spoke about fake news versus real leaks, and I was wondering if any of you have a comment on how he views the difference between what his concept of fake news is and how that relates to the leaks that he perceives as a real threat to his administration.
Well, I was mulling over that line and trying to go figure it out. So wind the clock back all the way to October when he was reading out from Wikileaks documents that he had, which were not classified, that he had read from the Podesta emails and so forth, that came from inside Hillary Clinton's campaign or among her top aides. And then contrast that with what he said in recent days. And his view of the importance of leaks seems to have changed. He said the words, "I love WikiLeaks," in October. I haven't heard those repeated in recent times. But I think what's happened with the phrase fake news is it has been adopted in part by this administration, but certainly by many of its supporters and by many others, to decry any piece of news that they do not like or find not credible. Now, in the case of these leaks about General Flynn, in the end, he's the one who decided for cause, whatever that cause was, to dismiss General Flynn. So he must have concluded that some of the data which we ultimately got and used to explain all of this was actually true. So I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that phraseology.
It's a term that muddies the waters in a way, because if you parse what Trump was saying, essentially saying these leaks are true, but he considers the reporting on them fake news, and that is just inconsistent, and it's one of the issues there. But the idea that you, and this is the mystery to be pursued, and that is what actually happened with Flynn, because Trump said, "Oh yeah, I would have supported him. I would have had him have these conversations." If you think about it, those conversations, at least as reported now, don't seem criminal or particularly unusual. If somebody's national security advisor about to become that, have that job, and you talk to the Russians, obviously sanctions are a key issue. Apparently he didn't say we'll make a deal. He said we'll revisit it. I think totally reasonable. So why was he fired? And that question has not really been answered sufficiently, in my view.
Before we wrap up, Ben, I wanted to give you a chance. Had you thought over the question from Bob about the worst case?
Wow. Wow. That's a tough one, because you then inevitably get into confirming things that you can't talk about.
That's
from
the
back
reason
in the
I
91.
asked it.
Exactly. And that's why he's a legend. But certainly there are things. I mentioned the Terrorism Financial Tracking Program, TFTP, and the value that provided to the country. So there are public examples out there. I won't say that that's the worst one I ever saw, but there's certainly public examples of things that have happened out there that I think where the balance has not been struck perfectly.
Final thoughts on Pentagon Papers legacy. David, you want to start?
Sure. I think it was foundational to everything that we do. I was still working my way out of, I think, elementary school or junior high school when Pentagon Papers happened.
We don't want to hear that.
So I would hardly be an expert on all of it. But I have to say that from what I've read in history, no, I think Bob had it exactly right when he said that if it had not been for that decision, I don't think we could have gone on to do what it is that we go do today. And I think that one of the big concerns we have is whether or not, rather than building on that decision, we are seeing the pendulum swing and seeing erosions of it. And that would worry me the most.
And even in that decision, the Pentagon Papers decision, in a book on the Supreme Court, Scott Armstrong and I did decades ago, we looked at some of the documentation and interviewed the people about that decision. And Alexander Bickel, one of the great lawyers, argued for the New York Times in that case. And Bickel had the wisdom to realize that the famous Near case from the 20th century said, yeah, you can't have prior restraint, but it is quite possible that the government could stop the press from publishing sailing dates and troop numbers. And so it's not absolute. And so Bickel argued that to the court. In this case, no prior restraint, but of course it's not absolute. And Hugo Black, the great First Amendment justice, was just enraged by this, and he came back to his clerks and he said, even the New York Times has a lawyer that doesn't believe in the First Amendment, because as far as Black was concerned, this was absolute. And if you dig into the legal intricacies, which maybe you have, it is not an absolute right. And there are things like sailing dates and troop numbers that clearly Supreme Court precedent says the press cannot publish. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, but it is foundational in terms of changing this balance, and the fact that what the government would often be interested in is stopping the publication. And by changing that in terms of basically saying the difficulty of a prior restraint really fundamentally was a shift, and that's what leads to these conversations and other things. So it puts the government in a place where it's kind of like, well, this is out there now. Are we going to go after the press? What is it that we're going to do? That's very different than what I think some in government would want to do when something comes up like this. Is, well, darn it, let's go into court and stop that. And of course, if you were to do that, you're facing a huge burden where you'd have to be something very factual, like this is the war plans of what our troops are going to do in this city on Saturday, and this is where facts matter. Bob alluded to this a little bit earlier in terms of whether there would be a case, what the court would do, and that was one of the questions. Facts make a huge difference, even in Supreme Court litigation. It is not just a broad philosophical argument. What those underlying facts are, and one of the reasons is, of course, the Pentagon Papers is not sailing dates of the ships. It is not, here's our deployment of how we're protecting troops. How the facts matter and how those cases
And so if there's a next case in the future, let's hope the New York Times gets a lawyer who believes in the First Amendment.
I don't know if he's going to be calling you, though, Ben. Thank you all very much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it. And thank you for being a great audience. Good questions.
I've actually met you once before. I was in Greg Miller's class last semester. I think I'm joining you on the phone. Hi, I'm Nina. Nice to meet you. I'm helping with this. I want to find more moderators there. Okay, nice. Oh, always something No, I'm our assistant princess. Yes. the microphone.
Oh yes, I thought you guys knew each other. I'm sorry. Yeah. Everyone's gonna make some money. Yes, that's good. Yeah. Oh, they're in the back there. Yeah. Yes.
And so a break in this Georgetown University hosted symposium looking at how journalism has changed since the Pentagon Papers of 1971 and the implications for national security leaks and sources in the digital age. You saw the Washington Post's Bob Woodward in the first panel. The Post's executive editor, Martin Barron, will be on the second panel. We'll have that for you in about 15 minutes.
That we don't understand.
For those who are newly arrived, I'm Sanford Unger, and I'll just wait for people to find their seats. I'm Sanford Unger. I'm very glad to welcome you to a continuation of our symposium on the legacies of the Pentagon Papers. Some of you were with us last night as well, and then earlier this morning. You know, when putting something like this together, one of the best sources of not only ideas for questions and panelists and also moderators are students. And so I wanted to make sure that we had at least one faculty member at Georgetown who had the respect of students and was known by students and as somebody who is interested in furthering dialogue of this sort. And all signs pointed to Ellen Gorman, who is a lecturer in the English department and is particularly interested in the Pentagon Papers for their cultural significance and what they've told us about the evolution of democratic society in this country. So Ellen graciously agreed to be the moderator of this panel, and I will turn things over to her now. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you very much. This is an exciting opportunity to talk to some eminent people right now about what's going on. The title of this panel is What Will Happen Next? And I'm looking forward to hearing what they think is going to happen next with regard not only to the legacy of the Pentagon Papers, but to the last few weeks and what's been going on in terms of what I see as changing definitions of the term leak and the idea of civil servants, different segments of society seeing themselves as bulwarks against some kind of encroachment of a lack of understanding of facts or news or what the truth is. I think one quote that's really informative comes from Sandy's book, which we all have been referring to this morning. In the decision of the judge, Murray Gurfein, the decision about the Pentagon Papers and whether or not the New York Times would be allowed to publish them, he's made the following declaration. The security of the nation is not at the ramparts alone. Security also lies in the value of our free institutions. A cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. These are troubled times. I think we could say the same is true now. There is no greater safety valve, he claimed, for discontent and cynicism about the affairs of government than freedom of expression in any form. This has been the genius of our institutions throughout our history. It is one of the marked traits of our national life that distinguish us from other nations under different forms of government. And that's certainly one issue that I'd like to talk with Susan, Pat, and Marty about is the differences in American media and government and how these things play out here. And I think Judge Gurfein's words will help us lead into our discussion. We have Marty Barron here, who is the executive editor of the Washington Post. He's been with the Post since 2012. Before coming to the Post, he was the editor of the Boston Globe, where he directed an investigation into abuse in the Catholic Church, which resulted in a Pulitzer Prize, and also in a film called Spotlight, which I'm sure many of you have seen. He's also a recent recipient of the Hitchens Award for an author or journalist whose work reflects a commitment to free expression and inquiry, a range of depth of intellect, and a willingness to pursue the truth without regard to personal or professional consequence. So I think that's quite an audacious prize, and I'm so excited to have him here. Susan Hennessey is managing editor of Lawfare, general counsel of the Lawfare Institute, and is also now at the Brookings Institute. She's a fellow there in national security law. Prior to joining Brookings, she was an attorney in the Office of General Counsel of the NSA. A recent article she co-wrote for the Lawfare blog called The Law of Leaks, I think is requisite reading for right now. It's an examination of the laws surrounding government leaks, how the White House might seek to investigate them, and how we might see them as a remedy in terms of information with regard to failings, potential failings in the government, what the nature of leak investigations and enforcement mean for the government and the people in general. We also have Pat Rowan, who is a partner at the law firm of McGuire Woods, where he focuses on international and national security matters. Before joining McGuire Woods, he was for 18 years at the Department of Justice. During his time there, he served as Assistant Attorney General for National Security, where he managed DOJ's national security investigations and prosecutions, and handled oversight of all espionage investigations, among other things. In November of 2016, he was also named a member of the new administration's landing team for the Department of Justice. So thank you so much, all three of you, for coming. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and maybe we'll talk at the end a bit more about the legacy of the leaks, the Pentagon Papers. We heard Daniel Ellsberg last night speak at length about the process he went through in terms of providing information to the press, his discussions with various members of the government about how this might play out, and his decision as a citizen and as a civil servant about why he felt this information needed to be known by the American people. My first question is for Marty. The Post has been, as we mentioned in the first panel, sort of one of the major players right now in terms of reporting about what's been going on, this sort of continued question about what a leak is, whether it is more, as Bob Woodward said in our last panel, kind of vigorous reporting that elicits information as opposed to an actual leak, a document dump or something like that that's brought to the paper. I think that it's interesting to think about the way that the plethora of information that's coming out now is processed. How does the Post sort through not only the amount of information, but also, what do people who give information to the Post expect will be the result, do you think? If you have any notion of that, I'd love to hear.
Well, first of all, I would say that there's not a plethora. It's actually quite limited what's being released, and we would welcome more. I think there's a lot more to be known, and if people have more to reveal, we'd certainly be receptive to receiving it. So it's actually quite limited. Leaks, that's a very broad term. It can apply to a lot of different things. I think in most instances, as in these recent instances over the last several weeks, reporters have spent their careers developing sources, cultivating them, talking to them, building up confidence. These are beat reporters, the people on our staff. They've covered intelligence for a very long period of time. Other people who've covered Justice Department, law enforcement of every type, and they're able to sort of, as a result of cultivating these sources, they've been able to gather information. In other instances, things are dropped in our lap. We have on our website actually a big welcome sign to people to send us stuff, and we provide all sorts of ways that they can send it to us with what we hope is a high degree of confidentiality. In the perhaps most well-known recent case, obviously Edward Snowden provided a huge volume of documents to us and to The Guardian, and ultimately to some other publications that were highly classified. And he initiated that effort, even though he was not familiar initially with Glenn Greenwald or Bart Gellman. He was introduced to them by a filmmaker, Laura Poitras. And so that was an instance where somebody just came forward to us, and we then looked through those documents. Why do people provide this information? I mean, there are a variety of reasons. Obviously, in the case of Snowden, he says that he felt that the government had gone to an extreme in terms of the amount of surveillance of individuals, both within this country as well as in other countries, and that motivated him. There are other people may feel aggrieved for one reason or another. Why do people leak? The reason people leak in the realm of intelligence is probably similar to the reason they leak in other realms, and that they just have some reason for doing so. It could be a broad range of reasons for doing so. We want to know what the motive is, but ultimately we want to evaluate the information in its own right.
Okay. David Sanger from the New York Times in the last panel talked about a Dropbox that the Times has now offered to people. And he indicated that there was a higher percentage of valuable information than he thought there would be. He said he thought there would be about 99% just non-information, but he sees more like 10% now of usable, quantifiable information.
They have something similar to us.
Okay.
I don't know what the volume is. I don't look at it myself. So we do have people who review it. It's circulated to the appropriate people to examine. It's generally a small percentage that is in fact worthy of publication and our efforts. And I don't know what that percentage would be. But even if it's 1%, we'll take it.
Do you have something like that?
We do.
Okay.
It's right there on the homepage of our website, and when you click through, it offers about 8 different ways that you can send us information confidentially. Yeah.
Okay, great.
There's always the mail too, by the way.
Okay, old school.
That's how the New York Times was able to get at least a portion of Donald Trump's taxes was ordinary mail.
Yeah. Okay.
Pretty secure actually. So.
Sounds good. Many routes to follow. Susan and Pat, can you walk us through the sort of roots of how this might play out in terms of repercussions for someone who decides to provide information to something like the Washington Post or the New York Times? Is there a procedure where they need to be sort of counseled by attorneys? I know Ellsberg talked about that last night, that he went to an attorney and asked about what the repercussions might be. Can you see that things have changed in terms of, for instance, the Espionage Act, how that might, or that things now in the digital age have made prosecution fundamentally different? Harsher or not? I know in the article you mentioned that you see anti-leak prosecutions not being something that are more likely to happen now.
Go ahead.
So I think one thing that's sort of important to separate out is the rhetoric, the way the government talks about leaks and protections of classified information, and then sort of what happens in practice. So we see it from both sides of the aisle, these very strong terms, of incredible irresponsibility. Obama took a lot of hits for it. Certainly George W. Bush took very strong criticism over the protection of classified information. And there's always been this sort of, this righteous indignation in terms of how we discuss leaks in the public. The actual sort of ecosystem of the federal government in general, and not just classified information, but sort of that larger body of sensitive private information that's not meant for public disclosure, it's a more nuanced ecosystem, right? So we know that the government, there is authorized leaks. There are quasi-authorized leaks. There are people like Snowden who sort of dump lots of primary source materials. And so sort of whenever we think about what repercussions might look like, it's important to sort of put them in the context of understanding where in the spectrum we fall. So one of the most recent prosecutions related to leaks was actually of General Cartwright, who has pled guilty and has since been pardoned by President Obama for confirming a piece of information. That actually was a sort of a quasi-authorized, right? He was authorized to have the conversation with the journalist, maybe said something he shouldn't have or didn't intend to, then ultimately was prosecuted or pled guilty to a charge on lying to federal agents. And so this is, I think that is a pretty good demonstration of sort of the complexity of this space. It's not just somebody going rogue. It's not necessarily somebody blowing the whistle. Some people have contacts with press because they're actually trying to enhance national security, right? A publication has a story, they want to run with it. They might need additional context, either in order to present it fairly and accurately, or in order to be convinced that certain pieces of information shouldn't be brought to the public. So certainly it's a very serious obligation. There are consequences for having unauthorized contacts with the media, especially in the intelligence community, but it's a little bit more complex than just, have you leaked information or have you not leaked information? There's lots and lots of moving pieces in the space.
So obviously the legal repercussions then would vary if it's a goodwill leak or a sanctioned leak or something that's kind of a rogue action from a civil servant. All of these would result in different kinds of ramifications?
Right, so I don't think it's necessarily sort of intent-based, right? So are you, did you have a good leak or a bad leak? It's more in terms of, it's not possible to investigate everything. Obviously, not everyone faces the same types of consequences. And so just these, putting them in their appropriate context. And it's really levels of mitigation, right? So once sort of the line has been crossed, an agency does do a referral for an investigation. What we usually end up seeing in terms of actual punishment is not necessarily for the disclosure of information in the first instance, but for additional aggravating factors that occur afterwards, like trying to hide it, right? Sort of the cover-up being worse than the crime.
Right. Pat, in your answer, if you would be willing to include maybe what you see as potential changes in terms of the Trump administration's response to leaks. I know there was a discussion earlier about the Obama administration's sort of a line of not wanting to prosecute reporters themselves in some cases. Do you see that changing?
Well, you mentioned I was on the landing team for DOJ. I have no idea what the Trump administration wants to do about leaks. So I just don't want you all to misunderstand. But I think as a general matter, every administration has struggled with this, and it's not just the Obama administration that set out and said, look, our focus is going to be on the leaker and not the media outlet that received the information. And that's one of the challenges of leak investigations, is that you have this person, the reporter out there, that is this remarkable source of information about where they got their leak from, but the investigation works around that person. And that was true in the Obama administration and before that. It's a long-standing policy that DOJ adopted, I think, at the beginning because they didn't want to suffer a statute that might encroach upon their investigative prerogatives. So they put in place a policy that requires AUSAs and FBI agents to come to Main Justice and get approval from the Attorney General before they subpoena a reporter. And that policy is part of why we have seen so few leak investigations over the years. And it's a very real check on the investigative zeal of an agent or a prosecutor to go after the reporter who they see as having all the information. So I don't think that will change. Within that process, there is a judgment call that the Attorney General makes where they don't have much in the way of constraints except a sense of how to balance national security versus freedom of the press. Mm-hmm. And so could an individual Attorney General strike that balance differently than another one? I'm sure they could. But there's a long sort of institutional tradition there of taking that very seriously. And I wouldn't expect that to be discarded very easily.
Okay. Bob Woodward seemed to be particularly concerned about sort of attitudes changing towards reporters. I don't know, Marty, if you at the Post have thought about this as well, but the idea that might inhibit some reporting to the extent that they feel that there could be some kind of challenge or that they would be in fear of.
Well, you know, I mean, I have no idea what the Trump administration might do in the case of a leak investigation, whether they we'll see if they only try to go after the leaker or they try to go after the reporters. I mean, I think we'll have to wait and see. I hope they're not coming after. Would certainly be my strong preference that they not come after reporters, and I don't think that they should. You know, there are also issues about how justice pursues such an investigation. The Obama administration put in some guidelines about, you know, what sort of the rules that would govern subpoenas of reporters' phone calls and things of that sort. I would hope that the administration would continue to follow those guidelines, which were the result of some extensive conversations with media organizations arising out of their investigations of leaks received by James Rosen of Fox and Jim Risen of the New York Times and several others, and the AP. And so, but, you know, when Attorney General Sessions was going through his confirmation hearings, he was asked about that, and he kind of ducked the question and said that he hadn't really studied it and he didn't really know. So we don't have an answer on that. As to how we would do our reporting, I think we would continue to do the reporting the way that we always have. I don't think anybody, certainly at the Post or at other major media organizations, feels intimidated in any way. We feel that we have a job to do, that we're going to continue to do that job, and everybody comes in every day with the idea that they're just going to do their job the way they did it. They did it previously, no matter what the pronouncements are that come out of the administration or the president himself.
So just to follow up, sort of, I think one reason for the sense of anxiety, despite the fact that we really haven't seen anything from the administration beyond, you know, some errant statements here and there, is that the protections here really are normative and not legal, right? There's not a statute that says this is what the Justice Department can do or can't do. There's a great deal of discretion. They couldn't investigate everything if they wanted to. So that norm of not only prioritizing political opponents or embarrassing leaks, the Justice Department rules, which are discretionary, right? They could theoretically alter them, and so I think a little bit of sort of the concern is matching that sense of there's a little bit of vulnerability because there's not kind of clear lines here, paired with an administration that has sort of prided itself on breaking norms and not having as much sort of respect for those institutional sort of independence and norms that we rely on a lot. And so I think that's led to a little bit of just a feeling of anxiety. We don't yet know if it's justified or not, but I think it's a recognition that really what we're talking about here is not some legal protection. It's sort of respect for the institution, respect for the institution of the press, respect for an independent Department of Justice, those kinds of things. Those are really just matters of agreement and of sort of public civic virtue. And so I think that's where some sense of concern is coming from.
I agree. I know, Marty, you've said several times lately that we are not at war with the administration, some idea of some kind of oppositional sense, but there have been claims, maybe they're errant comments, as Susan says, or maybe not, but that the press is the opposition party. How do you see that sort of new paradigm, even if only coming from certain people at the White House, that doesn't affect you at all? And Susan, certainly, I think at Lawfare Blog, a lot of people now are going to that kind of niche journalism in a way to understand things like the executive order and all of the different cases that have been filed now, and to kind of parse for lay people how this works, how it all plays out, how they might look to the future, and that in some ways you are a media outlet, and then thus members of the opposition party as well? I don't know.
We occupy a little bit of a different space. I don't really consider us sort of, I guess we're a media outlet in some sense. We're not journalists, we're lawyers, and sort of lawyers that have a very technical conversation amongst sort of the national security bureaucracy. So it's been a very interesting technical conversation between a very passionate couple of dozens of, more than that, but a relatively small group. Now there is lots more interest from the outside. I think there's a hunger for expertise, and also a hunger for sort of the presentation of primary source materials. I think the press plays a little bit of a different role, but certainly lots of different forms of outlets are having to navigate whatever this new sort of place is.
Well, look, I mean, I've only said once, actually, because I was asked the other day about this opposition thing. And I said that, we're not at war with the administration, we're at work. And that's what we're doing. We're doing our job. And we're doing it, I think, the way that it's supposed to be done. I think that we've entered dangerous territory when being independent, which is what we are, what we should be, and what we will be, where being independent is portrayed as the opposition. I don't think that being independent is the opposition at all. We would, if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, you can be sure we would be applying all sorts of investigative resources toward her administration as well, as we actually did during the campaign, contrary to lots of statements otherwise. And so, we were independent of her campaign. We were independent of the Obama administration. We're independent of the Trump administration. And being independent does not make you the opposition. And I think that it's disturbing that being independent is now portrayed as being part of the opposition. It seems like some sort of domestic version of, after 9/11, George W. Bush said something along the lines of, if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. It kind of sounds like that on the domestic front. So we're not, with them in the sense that we're part of them, but we're not terrorists either. We're just doing our jobs.
I just, the idea of the new paradigm, I mean, I do think it's important to recognize that while this has hit very quickly in the new administration, it's not at all unusual for an administration to at some point suffer, it feels, harm through leaks, and to all of a sudden be very tough on leaks. It's not at all unusual for somebody like a senior intelligence official to come to DOJ and say, we send you all these crime reports. We report all these leaks to you. Why haven't there been any cases made? So that pressure on the system has certainly existed before, and obviously I recognize that the amount of that pressure can vary. But there is a process in place. These investigations are done by the same people that did them in the Obama administration, and there are challenges that don't change, regardless of how badly the president or the administration may want to see a leak case made. There are a lot of hurdles that have to be gotten over, and those are still there. I think I missed Mr. Ellsberg's talk. The idea of consulting an attorney in advance is an interesting one. I mean, one of the problems that I think anybody who's involved in a leak investigation has to worry about is whether or not they actually get charged with a crime is, the terrific stress and potentially financial cost that they may suffer in the context of just dealing with the investigation itself. And that's probably not going to change.
Losing a clearance, perhaps, or something like that.
Obviously, losing a clearance is a killer, but even before then, having to go hire a lawyer and having to worry, having to go home to your spouse and tell them that, you know, the FBI called and they want to speak to me next week. And those are really challenging things, regardless of what happens when the investigation finally shakes out.
Let me just, if I could just add, I mean, I think that, you know, even during the Obama administration, as a result of their leak investigations and their concern that, you know, that information was being given in an unauthorized way to the press, there were so many people in that administration who wouldn't even talk to the press for fear that they would be subjected to a leak investigation and that they would have to incur these incredible costs. Normal conversations that you would have to sort of explain policy and things like that, you know, people in government were saying, don't ever call me, don't ever send me an email, because that would could subject me to an investigation, and it's going to cost me a fortune. And even though I'm not leaking you anything, the very fact that I spoke to you makes me a suspect. And I think that's a you know, a concerning environment for our government, that so many people in government would be terrified of even speaking to the press in an ordinary fashion.
There are a lot of discussions now about the sort of idea of the civil servant trying to figure out his or her role with regard to the oath that's made to protect and defend the Constitution to all enemies, foreign and domestic. So I understand what you're saying about just civil servants not wanting to be implicated, maybe not feeling some kind of need or onus on his or her part to release information. But what about those people that do and that see themselves as defending? So in some cases, people argued that they saw Sally Yates doing that, defending the people, defending the Constitution, as opposed to sort of having an allegiance to the administration or even to her role in the sense that she was connected. And those independent actors, civil servants, seeing themselves as needing to come forward, whether they're leaking or providing information or having some kind of connection. Yeah. Do you think that that's changing now, that that has a potential to change?
I don't know. It's probably better to ask people who've been civil servants, which I've never been.
So first, I think it's important, particularly in sort of discussing Sally Yates' letter and resignation or firing. There's a difference between sort of the career civil servants, which are non-political appointees, and then political appointees. So Yates occupied a little bit of a strange position because, of course, she was an Obama administration appointee who'd been held over as the acting AG. And so those two groups are in relatively different positions. There's also a difference between actually classified information and just, you know, private phone calls, right? The president's phone calls with another foreign leader, right? Some of the other leaks that we've heard about, kind of the chaos or dysfunction of the current administration that don't actually touch on classified materials. So certainly, I think most civil servants really take that oath, you know, to heart and really mean it and mean every part of it. That their allegiance is to the Constitution and not to a president. That their allegiance is, you know, it transcends politics necessarily. You know, whenever we talk about leaks or disclosures of classified information, it's often, the leakers often use sort of these grandiose terms, right, or sort of terms of personal conscience. We hear Edward Snowden talk a lot in these terms. The problem in the realm of classified information is that no one person has all of the relevant facts. And so whenever you're participating in a system where the information is highly consequential, right? There's information that, you know, the consequences of leaking can be people's lives or you know, sensitive military operations, or right? This is a high stakes area. The problem sort of with the notion of everybody going off on their own and making an independent judgment about how they discharge their duty with regards to classified information is that they're substituting a personal judgment for sort of the judgment of a relatively well-developed system in deciding what information needs to be secret and what doesn't. it's challenging because there is an overclassification problem, and there is ambiguity. That's information is classified that does not actually, fall within the categories of, a grave harm to national security or some harm to national security. It's just a path dependency or lots of different bureaucratic pressures. But whenever we get to sort of that core part of the information, we really don't want every civil servant sort of going out on their own and making an independent judgment. We want a system that is informed because this is a high stakes area. And so I do think we should sort of be careful in terms of how we talk about discharging that oath. Yes, the oath is just something larger than a single administration, and sometimes the courageous and morally correct choice is actually transgressing the law in very limited circumstances.
Yeah, I'm not valorizing that, but I think that's certainly a discussion now that people are having. And with regard to Ellsberg, that's a decision he made, certainly, that the Pentagon or the government writ large, he felt was not doing something that made sense to him. He quoted Chelsea Manning last night saying, I realized I was participating in something that I didn't agree with, that I didn't sit well with my conscience at all. So it's not an encouragement necessarily of civil servants to go rogue, but with regard to examples like Snowden, Manning, and particularly Ellsberg in this case, is that not something that you can imagine people are thinking about these days? The repercussions are severe and grave. We've already talked about some of the legal implications, but how do you see that playing out if something like an Ellsberg were to decide, I don't have faith in the system, that this sort of mitigates any issues that might upset me, so I need to do something here because I feel like I'm being compromised in terms of the oath I've taken. How do you see it playing out in the future, Pat? What?
Well, there are whistleblower protections in the law, but they are also very limited in the national security space. Mm-hmm. And I think the instances where that issue has been raised with folks like Snowden and Manning, they have not seen that as a viable option. Mm-hmm. I think that just to recognize that that's an arguable route that folks don't seem to find very attractive. And again, I think in the national security world, it's a very hard to fit yourself into that. The other thing I would say, just as a preliminary point, just to sort of state the obvious, there's no sort of public benefit defense in connection with a leak prosecution. So if you get yourself to the point of actually facing a prosecution, at least thus far, the court, there's nothing in the statute, and the courts have not recognized some sort of defense that I was doing what I thought my conscience and the Constitution dictated. Now, there may be a time when that defense is sort of created because of the compelling circumstances of the case, but it's not there now. And do civil servants think, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I can't sit by and watch this happen. I think they do. I think they have in the past, and I think some will in the future. It is interesting to think about whether or not whether the kind of quick spate of issues here at the beginning of administration would sort of encourage that, because people think, well, maybe we've crossed a line and this is more acceptable now than it's been before. Obviously, from the perspective of an administration and the national security community generally, they want to push back against that idea. They really want to discourage the idea that, okay, we're now at a new space where it's a little bit more acceptable to do what your conscience dictates.
One thing I think it's important to sort of, I think most people, because of the president's press conference yesterday and sort of the events of the past week or so, are thinking kind of about the leaks in regard to former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn's phone calls. Mm-hmm. I have no personal knowledge of how those were obtained, but in all likelihood, it was pursuant to a FISA warrant or something that would render the content of those calls classified material. And obviously, that was made public. It was given to the press. It appears pretty clear at this point that there was an effort to bring it to the administration, right? So sort of early briefings. And then it appears that what was sort of the motivation for the leaks was the administration's failure to recognize the concerns of these individuals that were in the career civil service, and then also false statements to the public. And so that's something that I think will start to become more of a pressure point, or may encourage really, not unprecedented behavior, but certainly an unprecedented scale. We're seeing more leaks than we ever have. I mean, really, the rate is astounding, and that it really it's going to be in response to how we hear the administration talk. I do think that if there becomes a sense that that the White House is not accurately representing things, that there will be more of a tendency to try and alleviate that pressure. There is always a tension between sort of the need for secrecy and security and the right to know and legitimacy and sort of the basic compact of the government and the people. That is one mechanism to relieve the pressure, and so hopefully we will see a little bit more responsible rhetoric moving forward. But if that continues to be a sort of a persistent feature in this administration, where there's a belief that the political levels are not just not being forthcoming, but also affirmatively lying to the public, I do think we're going to see really an unprecedented amount of leaks. Those will have security consequences. I mean, we shouldn't pretend as though because we happen to agree with the person's motivation, there aren't actually consequences to these things. There are, but I don't think that we're going to see sort of it slow down until we see a change at the top.
Okay. Marty, you've talked about the Post will keep doing what it's always done. There's some autonomy. It's not in opposition. You're doing the work you've always done. What about, in the current context, though, some kind of claim that the mainstream media, newspapers like the Washington Post, are providing news that isn't based in reality, that it's alternative, that you have maybe other media outlets that are providing oppositional information in some ways? How does the Post, and just the Post then, deal with this sort of kind of context where even...
Where we're being accused of fake news, is that it, basically? I don't know. You're very tempted to respond like whatever, but there is nothing. I mean, there's nothing to it. I mean, the fact is, let's take the stories that were written about the National Security Advisor, Flynn. I mean, they were entirely accurate. They haven't been contradicted. There's, when you say, well, the leaks are true, but the stories are fake news, or whatever the line was, it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, the stories were accurate in every sense. They continue to be so, and I think they have served a public purpose. Here's someone who lied to the vice president, apparently. And certainly didn't tell the truth to the American public, and on a matter of real consequence. And so I think this makes the case that sometimes these so-called leaks serve the public interest, and it serves the public interest for news organizations like the Post and others to publish this information and to provide it to the American public, the accurate information to the American public. And that's what we ought to be doing.
Okay. Pat, can you help explain to us, in terms of the changes since 9/11, the Patriot Act, changes in surveillance of the American people, and in general, a sort of increased digitization of information, how does that affect work within the Department of Justice, for instance, with regard to information that's classified information that's been leaked?
Well, there's a bunch of different impacts, some of which are sort of pro-prosecution and some of which are anti-prosecution. I mean, among other things, one of the results of the reworking of the intelligence community after 9/11 is there was such a push for information sharing, and that means that in the context of a specific investigation, the number of people who may have received the classified information has dramatically expanded. And that's obviously one of the keys to having a successful investigation, is starting off with a relatively small number of suspects. So information sharing has made arguably the government's national security efforts generally much more efficient, but it has made it harder to investigate a leak. Not so much because of 9/11, obviously, but just the increasing digital nature of our world. There are many more digital records of everything that's done, and they're much more easy to get a hold of. I mean, I assume that in the past, a government official could sit in his office and use a landline in his office to call a reporter and speak to him. And now that official, if she chooses to use her cell phone, she creates a digital record that didn't exist with the landlines. If she, there's the case involving this State Department employee named Kim that was in touch with James Rosen. I mean, one of the pieces of evidence they used in that case was they were walking out of the secured turnstiles coming in and out of the building at the same time, which obviously didn't exist before as a bit of evidence, but now they can show, look, these two guys walked out together and came back in together. So there's a lot of little pieces like that that make it easier to identify the individual that may have met with the reporter and spoken to him that didn't exist in the past.
So when then National Security Advisor Flynn was, he was preparing to be the National Security Advisor, was on the phone, he would have understood that those conversations were being at least tracked or recorded, and how in that case it seems like it maybe didn't change behavior, but it must have changed the behavior of officials and civil servants and reporters. As Marty mentioned, some people are saying, don't even email me, I don't want that connection. In what ways does the legal system allow for the idea that people understand that they're surveilled, and so they have some culpability if they're doing something that can be traced?
Well, I think that the key thing you see is that it's harder to lie to the FBI. And you see a lot of cases where the problem is that they lie, and it's easier to prove the lie than it ever used to be. My assumption is in the past, if the FBI, they say, okay, it's 50 people that knew about this bit of classified information. We're going to go talk to this 50 people, and we're going to ask them, did you ever meet with this reporter? Did you ever speak to this reporter? Do you know anything about this? Mm-hmm. And I assume that in many instances, people who had leaked would say, no, I didn't speak to him. And now they need to be much more aware that maybe not the content of that conversation, but the fact of the conversation is much more easily provable by getting a hold of that official's phone records and showing that he or she may have talked to a reporter, or at least called that number that's associated with a newspaper or something. So that's certainly one piece where it's changed.
I think people in general, from some of the pop cultural works around this, especially since 9/11, you watch 24 and Homeland, and people kind of assume that not only there's this surveillance, but that actual conversations are being detailed. Is there a sense, do you think, people looking to the media and to the government in general of understanding that this is all known and there needs to be more transparency because of this increased surveillance or increased digitization of the way that people are in contact with each other?
Just to sort of put on my former NSA lawyer hat, I think it's really important to note that there's no indication or allegation that Michael Flynn was being targeted or recorded. It's within the scope of the government's lawful authorities to target a foreign power under certain circumstances. It's not unusual for United States officials that interact with foreign powers in the conduct of their duties, including sometimes in transition periods, to be intercepted. That form of incidental collection. And so I just think it would be a mistake to sort of generalize that because a very limited subset of conversations might be picked up in the ordinary conduct of the government's foreign intelligence mission, that means that people should assume their conversations are recorded everywhere, or that there's no privacy in the content of communications. The other thing is that individuals who hold clearances and operate, work on national national security matters, consent to a series of rather detailed monitoring. They're given a lot of information about where they are observed and how. That's one of the conditions, right? You're vested with a great deal of trust in being given this information, and so one of the ways you reciprocate is both by undergoing the clearance process and polygraphs and a somewhat invasive process up front, but also agreeing to that kind of ongoing monitoring, and that's actually being done on a consent basis, right? You're agreeing to it.
Right. Okay. What do you think about the?
Well, look, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that was said, but in terms of being able to track where somebody is, it's a lot easier these days to do that. I mean, obviously, if somebody has a cell phone, you can see pretty much where the cell phone was at any particular time. Different apps have location information that would help tell where you are. I mean, if you're using Uber, they know where you are right now. They can show up and pick you up. And there are other apps that have that as well. Plus, there are cameras all over the place these days. I mean, in a lot of places that we don't notice them, they're tremendous. So they're, in a whole range of ways, it's easier to sort of track the movements of people in a way that didn't exist in, let's say, decades ago, a few decades ago. And that makes, I think, makes it more difficult for someone in government to provide information to the press, and more difficult for the press to sort of try to obtain that information. So I think it's a much more difficult environment right now.
Do you think it makes the public want more transparency in general?
It's hard to know what the public wants sometimes, but I mean, I think there are segments of the public that want a lot more transparency. I mean, there are people who believe, for example, that the opposition, the report that was done by a British intelligence officer that was circulating around Washington, that should have been, that we should have just published that. We should have made that available as soon as we got it. We did not do that. I mean, and I mean, ultimately, BuzzFeed did publish that document after CNN reported that the president himself was shown that, but we didn't do that, and we wouldn't do that. But I think that there are people in the public who criticize us for not having just made that document available. But we felt that there's a baseline of verification that needs to take place before we would ever do something like that. But there are people who believe that we're part of the problem if we're not releasing that information. On the other hand, there are another segment of the public that believes we're part of the problem because we're receiving leaks and things like that. And they don't want that level of transparency, and particularly in a time of threats to national security, terrorism and things like that, concerns particularly about terrorism, domestic terrorism, people tend to favor more security over transparency and even over privacy. And so, you know, the public opinion shifts from one time to the next. You know, when the Snowden stuff came out, I think there was a large sentiment among the public there was greater concern about privacy. And then as terrorism became a greater concern, there was more concern about security and less concern about privacy, and polls actually show that. So public opinion can swing, and a lot depends on which segment of the public you're talking about.
Is the Espionage Act still viable now with new changes in technology and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the changes in technology have affected the Espionage Act in terms of its use as a tool. Mm-hmm. The problem with the Espionage Act is it's a 1917 statute, and it has a series of ABCD, various provisions, including some which are clearly targeted at classic espionage and some which are more useful for a leak investigation, in that it is a disclosure of national defense information by someone who's authorized to receive it to somebody who's not authorized to receive it. And the statute, there's been a lot of discussion over the years that it's not a particularly good fit for these kinds of matters, for both because it's over-inclusive and under-inclusive in circumstances, but every time that there's been any serious effort to look at this, I think the conclusion that's been reached is this is too complicated and difficult to fix it. both from from the government's perspective, there might be a desire to make it easier to prosecute these cases, sort of have a more of a strict liability. Hey, if you disclose classified information, that's a crime. On the other hand, there's obvious concerns about that kind of a statute and how it would, dramatically restrict some activity that we all think is probably appropriate. So there's for a lot of reasons, people don't think it's beneficial to really dig into this and try to frame a new statute. So I think there's nothing about the digital age that has made it less useful. It's just the challenge of using an old law that wasn't particularly written for these kinds of problems, and certainly doesn't have the defenses in it that some people might want to see in this year for this kind of activity.
Do you see any, would it make sense to revise? Do you see any appetite for that in terms of the government and revising something like this, bringing it up to date?
So I would be surprised if sort of Congress could get together to pass a law to, there might be an appetite, but these are complex and politically fraught areas, and it's hard enough to sort of pass the basic appropriations laws these days. So the idea of sort of in practical terms, an update, I wouldn't hold my breath. That said, there is, the real shift here is probably in terms of the way sort of the digital revolution interacts with this stuff. It's the way we think about these things. So in the past, we've always sort of taken the approach that the press should publish anything that's accurate and newsworthy, right? That it should be true and it should have some public relevance. So a private fact about you, if that's not newsworthy, then it shouldn't be published. And something like the dossier that's certainly newsworthy but may or may not be true, that shouldn't be published. And that's sort of that's how we've gone. That's how we've arrived at this point. One of the challenges of sort of the massive scope of both the where information is aggregated, so the ability to really take lots and lots of things all at once, and the ability to launder information to the public in a different way. So if we look at, for example, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager's emails. So we had our intelligence services saying, that was hacked by a hostile foreign intelligence service. It's being distributed to the public for the purposes of, of influencing their positions, right? These are sort of active measures or other forms of espionage. We saw the press really struggling to say, well, it's certainly newsworthy and it's accurate, so is that, right? Does this qualify? And so we saw them sort of reporting on that information. I think that raises a really difficult question, which is WikiLeaks any different from the New York Times or the Washington Post's secure Dropbox, right? Is there, now that we have the ability to take lots and lots of information in a way that even the individuals that are receiving it don't necessarily know who's producing it or for what reasons, should their obligation moving forward be those sort of basic journalistic practices of, is it true and is it newsworthy? Or is there now an additional obligation, because we're going to be seeing these forms of leaks happen with more frequency just because there's lots more information, and because potentially the ability to understand who the source is might have changed.
That makes sense. Sandy Unger, in a recent piece in the Washington Post about sort of being called the opposition party, said, good, yay, this is good.
I didn't agree with Sandy on that one, sorry.
Well, maybe you can speak to that. Also, he mentions in the book that for a brief period after the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal, not only the Post but the press in general enjoyed a kind of honeymoon period.
Right.
But that by the mid to late 80s, that had kind of died out. So do you see in some ways a kind of resurgence of that in terms of people? I know I've heard that the Post and the Times have had increased subscribers.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually quite similar. As I was reading through Sandy's book before this panel, I was struck by the similarities between what happened all those years ago and what's happening now. There is a surge of subscriptions coming to organizations like ours, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal says it's gotten a surge as well. A number of other news organizations, even internationally, are reporting a sharp increase, like the Financial Times. Many of these come with notes that they're glad we're doing what we're doing. They want us to continue to do that kind of work. They're particularly interested in investigative work. They do believe that government should be held accountable, and they now feel that they can no longer take the work that we do for granted, and that they should actually support it by putting their hand in their pocket and actually buying a subscription. And we appreciate that because it actually is necessary to have the resources to do this kind of work. And so I do think that there is, among a segment of the population, increased confidence in the media. However, my concern is that I think we should all have all of us who work in the media should be concerned about the levels of confidence in our profession, which have been at historic low points. But there's a wide disparity between the confidence among people who are Democrats and people who are Republicans, and it's dropped dramatically among Republicans, particularly over the last 2 years during this campaign, where I think according to the latest Gallup poll, it's now among Republicans only at about 15%, where it was at a not terribly impressive 25% 2 years ago. And I think the confidence levels among Democrats is in the 40s, somewhere like that. So overall, we're in the 30s, which is not great. I mean, we're above Congress. We're above big business. Is not very impressive, but it also comes along with a significant decline in confidence in essentially all institutions, and the only ones that are holding their ground are the military, and to some degree law enforcement, although I think that's a little bit shaky too. And but pretty much all other institutions have seen a significant decline in public confidence. So, but right now we are seeing among a certain segment of the population increased confidence in what we do and a willingness to support the work that we do.
It's also kind of increased interest and confidence in lawyers now too. So I think in terms of going to seeing them as a bulwark in some ways, that's shifted. So all kinds of interesting changes. I would ask all three of you maybe to briefly say what you think of when you think of the Pentagon Papers and the decisions that were made, the repercussions. We've talked a little bit about Manning and Snowden and the idea of leaks in general. What do you see as the legacy? Maybe Pat, if you would start first.
Well, I guess I think that they really, Pentagon Papers and the issues that sort of came to the fore during that time really laid the road that we have been traveling on ever since. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that, the main criminal statute that might govern this kind of activity is from 1917. The Pentagon Papers was some years ago, and here we are now, and the legal landscape really hasn't changed much since then. And I would say that not only has the legal landscape not changed much, the approach that the Justice Department follows is about the same as it was, and so it's a pretty powerful set of events that has laid out a path that we're still on today.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so I think they're, obviously it's sort of the beginning of a process that has dramatically been altered by Manning, by Snowden, sort of in the past couple of years. I think sort of there are two features of the legacy that sort of we'll see how they play out, and that's one sort of the focus on the personal integrity of the leaker, him or herself, that's something that has really been a very important part of sort of our, the way we understand and conceptualize historical leaks, right? Was the person good or bad? And that has really framed the way people come to understand events that occur. I think more and more as these become more common, right? So Pentagon Papers are obviously a historically rare event, right? Sort of a very unusual thing that could sort of stand on its own. As we see these more frequently, I think how we address the notion that people are complex and they have lots of different motivations, and it isn't always necessarily clear, and that we might need to disentangle the way we think about leaks from just the personal heroism or integrity of an individual versus is this a good thing or a bad thing, and how do we want to think about information and legitimacy and sort of public transparency and those kinds of things. The other sort of feature is, the pendulum swing in terms of the adversarial nature of the press and the government. And so I think sort of, the moving from, a press that was willing to, when the government asserted a national security interest, sort of just said, you can't disclose this because someone will die as a result, and that's sort of the end of the conversation. Setting in motion the notion of a press that wanted to see the evidence, right? That this sort of evolving relationship of, okay, there's responsibility to be careful and to treat this information with appropriate sensitivity. Now you see journalists really saying, okay, you say that this is, somebody's going to be hurt if I publish this. Prove it. Show me something. And sort of more of that sort of challenging adversarial posture, which may have seemed like an annoyance in the past or in the recent past for those who felt more or less comfortable with the prior administration versus this one. I think we're really going to see sort of the importance of the role of independent journalism in our national security, and that's actually, they play a really, really important role in not only public transparency, but also in constraining those choices, ensuring that they are carefully made, because that little thing in your head that someday this is going to be on the front page of the Washington Post, I think really does influence the way government attorneys and people in the government in general think about their work. I think we're about to see a lot more of these things, and so having that sort of historical reference point is going to be important.
Makes sense. Great.
Well, when the whole Pentagon Papers case was taking place, I was in high school. So, but we had at the time an administration that was incredibly hostile to the press, very similar to, I think, what we have today. Incredible attacks on the press. The vice president of the time, Spiro Agnew, was constantly going after the press. He was the attack dog for the administration, and obviously Nixon himself had a deep level of animus toward the press. And as Sandy mentions in this book, that prior to the Pentagon Papers case, that it had a chilling effect on the press. And he cites in the book an ACLU report that came out that said that the press had gone from an extreme level of security prior to the Nixon administration to an extreme feeling of vulnerability. And that resonates today, I think, in some ways. I think it's very important that we make sure that there is no chilling effect today. I do think that the Pentagon's Papers case had an impact over all these decades since by energizing the press and reminding the press about its public service role. And I think that the press has tried to pursue that public service role perhaps more aggressively in the years since than it did in the years prior to the Pentagon cases. When I was thinking about this, as I was looking at the Pentagon Papers, I was thinking, wow, that looks like an easy decision to publish compared to some of the things that we're dealing with today, because it dealt with a report that involved the history of the Vietnam War and involvement in Vietnam. And it was kind of a history report. Now, it had revelatory information, but it didn't involve current operations. And so some of the kinds of things that we've been dealing with and we've been talking about here today, the disclosures have involved current operations. And I think that that's a much more difficult territory. In fact, I think one of the defenses on the Pentagon Papers was that it involved historical information. I do think that, you know, the Pentagon Papers case helped, obviously, establish the idea that there shouldn't be prior restraint by the government. But even that's qualified because, as has been pointed out, there was some allowance for some prior restraint. And lawyers since have pointed to that to say this ruling is not a complete victory for the press on that front. You know, and I think that it doesn't, the case doesn't really help us very much in post-publication. So there were some threats even to Katharine Graham, I think, about sort of, I don't know if they were veiled or not veiled, or there were some statements that the administration said they really weren't threats, but they sure sounded like threats, that the Washington Post could be prosecuted for publication of those papers, notwithstanding the Supreme Court ruling in the case. And there have been other instances where people have been threatened with prosecution. So obviously the case was helpful. I think it helped set a framework for the press in the decades since, which I think has been helpful and has served the public interest. But it does not provide us complete protection. And we're in this sort of strange territory and unsettled territory today, and we and the government have to operate in that territory.
Great, thank you. I'm sure we have some great questions. Who has? Yes, thank you.
Chris Blair, following the actions of FBI Director Comey 2 weeks prior to the election, and then his corresponding inaction following the information that came out about Michael Flynn and the FBI's statement that they were not going to be investigating him, do you all have an opinion on the apparent politicization of federal agencies, and going forward, the effects it could possibly have on potential leaks?
Would you like a particular person to start, or anyone?
So an easy one first. I think it's a very, very dangerous path to walk down, to start imputing motives to people that whenever we don't have all of the relevant information. One way to sort of know whether or not you have acted in a fair way is when both sides are equally angry at you. And so I think that if we look at Director Comey's actions sort of over the totality of the campaign, both sides were equally angry. That doesn't endorse or condemn any particular decision. But one thing that I do think is troubling is starting to hear this rhetoric that frankly was set by the current administration itself about sort of the politicization of the intelligence community or the politicization of the FBI, and right that we should be inherently suspicious of these things. That will not help us defend our institutions to the extent they're under attack. It does highlight the importance of not just a functioning press, but also a press that's able to understand the difference between genuine leaks and false leaks, right? So one thing that we saw after the leak, actually, of Comey's letter, right, that letter was to Congress and not to the public, was a series of stories that actually turned out to be false about the state of investigations into Hillary Clinton's email servers at that time. That's really problematic, right? So we're seeing seeing that actually false, untrue leaks are as potentially consequential as true ones. Similarly with the Michael Flynn story, there was early reports prior to the inauguration about the existence of these phone calls, maybe the content, and then a leaked story said, no, he's been cleared. The FBI says that there's nothing there. And that really sort of ended the inquiry until there was this later revelation. And so I think it's important to sort of take a step back whenever we think about career civil servants trying to do their job, or even political appointees in the government sort of trying to discharge their duties, how they interact with the press. I think sort of necessarily saying, this was done to help one candidate or the other. That's a serious allegation, and I think it's one we should be pretty careful and conservative before we make.
I agree with that. I mean, we don't know whether it was politicized or not. We only know that people say that it was politicized. I don't have actual information that says there was a political influence in the decisions that Comey made. People in the public and people within the political arena have made accusations, but I don't think we're in a position to say that was the motive at all.
The other thing I would say is that, just like any other organization, the work is done by people at a much lower level, and that work bubbles up in the state that it's in. So making a political decision about a matter like that is complicated. Even if a person has an ill motive, these facts are before them, and they exist, and they're not going to be. It's very hard, I think, to sweep facts aside and say, well, we're going to do X because that's what I want to do. An organization like the FBI is full of people who feel very strongly about following the rules, following not just the law, but following the standard practices of how they conduct an investigation. And so I also am not quick to assume that it would be very easy for somebody at a senior level to make a political decision if the facts were to push them in another direction.
Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Barron, can you give us some hope? I guess in the Watergate era, one had reporters that did their job, but we also had Congress that helped immensely to bring that to fruition. One didn't face alternate news and propaganda and false facts hitting the media, etc. Here it seems like the few responsible press are up against all kinds of obstacles to bring the truth out.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I would say that there are a lot of reporters who are doing their job today. This myth that somehow at the time of Watergate, you had these great reporters who all did their job, and today you have these reporters who don't do their job is just not true. I mean, what you did have then, I think, is healthier media institutions who had a lot more security and a lot more in the way of resources and things like that. Although, people who own the networks were kind of concerned about whether their licenses would be renewed and all of that. So I think that, so it certainly helps to have stronger media institutions. The situation in Congress obviously is highly relevant to whether there are investigations. Obviously, if there were a Democratic majority in Congress today, you would see a different set. You would see a different set of events, and things unfold in a different way and at a more rapid pace. But this is what we have. So, the internet environment is concerning on a lot of levels. I am deeply concerned about the spread of false information, and also just about people gravitating only to sources of information that affirm their pre-existing point of view. Both of those, I think, are concerning. We see people living in their own sort of parallel universes, information universes, and they don't intersect. And it's very hard to find common ground. And it's also very hard to find common ground in a democracy. You're asking for hope. I'm not helping you here. But
where's the hope?
I mean, it's very hard in democracy. You have to agree. I mean, there was a time we agreed on a basic set of facts, and then you disagree on the analysis of those facts, the interpretation of those facts, the prescription for solving the problems. But we agreed on the facts. What happened yesterday? We could agree on that. Now we can't. It was the late Senator Moynihan who said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Now, today, people believe they are entitled to their own facts. You have my facts, you have your facts, I have my facts. That is problematic for a democracy. And I don't know what we can do about that. I am very concerned about that. And I don't think it's helpful when we have politicians who endeavor to not just criticize us, not just marginalize us, but really endeavor to delegitimize us and actually to dehumanize us if you actually look at the language. I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's helpful to run down the key institutions in this country, whether it is the government institutions or others that are basically pillars of the society that we have and the democracy that we have. And that is what's happening today, unfortunately. So not terribly hopeful.
Gotcha. Oh, back there, baby. Yeah.
Thanks. You touched on it earlier about Congress's unwillingness or ambivalence to maybe creating a select committee to investigate the leaks, or for the Attorney General to appoint a special prosecutor or investigator to investigate the leaks. Given that it seems like more of the burden is falling on the press to conduct the investigation, and therefore it's possible, or we can predict that more leaks will come to the press as the investigation takes place with the press. Can you talk about the consequences of that?
So I think there's sort of two strains. So one is investigations into ties between the president and his associates, sort of ties to Russia, right? So that's sort of a broad bucket with lots of different strains. And then there are leaks sort of related to that investigation that go in both directions. So the Senate actually has formed the SSCI is undertaking an independent investigation. A number of other congressional committees are as well. The important thing, some people have called for sort of a bipartisan commission, something that looks more like the 9/11 Commission. That might be a good idea. The important thing is that the investigations that currently exist have two features. So one is they have the subpoena power, so they could force the government to produce certain tangible objects to them and make certain statements. That's why it's actually significant that we see leaks that say, hey, there's a transcript of these calls. There's a right there, they're bringing the forms of evidence to the public. That's significant for the independent investigation. To the extent that there's a concern, the executive branch might not fully discharge its function to the extent somebody's worried about that. The other feature is that these committees have the ability to review highly classified information. So that's another way that you can sort of control these types of investigations if you're worried about that or slant them, is use national security rationales to sort of prevent information from coming forward. So we have two sort of important pieces. The third piece that is absolutely critical, and we don't know if we have it yet, is a bipartisan motivation to get to the bottom of this and to get to the truth of the matter. And so we've seen some hopeful signs from Senators Lindsey Graham and John McCain and others. The more we hear about from both sides of the aisle discussions about sort of from a place of pre-political commitments, that this really isn't about beating up the administration, but saying we something is happening here that is threatening our basic institutions and the things that we sort of put before our individual party or policy preferences. These investigations will take a very long time, and they will require some political fortitude. And so I think what remains to be seen and will be really important is whether or not Congress sort of has that sense of courage and responsibility to discharge its constitutional duty here. We've seen some good signs and some bad signs. It will not be sort of a note of caution that this will not be a short process, or we'll be talking about these investigations for a very, very long time.
Pat, do you have any thoughts about that? Or?
No, I think the law enforcement, the FBI investigation, I understand what you said, your skepticism about the Attorney General, but I think that the FBI and line-level attorneys involved in the investigation will be very productive. And then the question will be, will what they find be shared more broadly? And that's, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on them, both from the media, from the Hill, to share that information. So there may be more that is learned about what they actually learn.
Okay, maybe one or two more questions? Yeah.
Hi, Gabriela Munoz. I'm a junior here at Georgetown. I just wanted to ask, because the digital age has made tracking easier, covering or observing easier, and even hacking easier, do you think at all that there might be a regression or a return to more old-fashioned forms of communication, either within agencies or between journalists and their sources?
Yeah, so if you've ever looked at a set of FOIA documents from the government and you see an email chain, oftentimes the last thing on that email chain will be, "Can you call me?" We are all adaptive organisms, right? And people will sort of, to the extent they are looking to seek out privacy and have conversations that aren't recorded, either pursuant to Public Records Acts or in their private capacities. I think that's sort of a natural instinct. How successful we'll be, how capable we are of actually opting out of sort of producing digital evidence remains to be seen. One thing that will be really important is just personal relationships. You have to know people and trust people, and sort of the core of understanding who's responsible, credible actors, both in the media and in the government. That's going to be really important.
Did you want to say something?
Well, actually, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say, particularly about young reporters, because we all have this stereotype about younger people not being as used to speaking face-to-face or on the phone, and they want to send a text instead, and whether or not how that affects the way young reporters report.
Right. Well, I am concerned of that. I would welcome a return to some of the old habits of telephone calls, meeting people in person. I think we need to go back to that. First of all, I think it actually facilitates better communication, a better understanding of what people are saying, rather than just responses to emails and things like that. I think that's helpful. I think everybody now is much more careful about what they put in emails, or at least they should be. I hope they will be. We've encouraged everybody to be, because a determined hacker can get in pretty much anywhere. I think we can see that, and we have to. Obviously, it's important that people have more safeguards on email and access to their information systems and things like that. It was interesting to me that the New York Times, when they got some pages of Trump's tax returns, that it was sent via mail, and rather than somebody faxing it or something like that. Anybody use fax anymore? I don't know, but or sending it, or taking a picture and sending it via email, but they used old-fashioned email. They put the wrong address on there. They should have put, 1301 K Street, Washington, D.C., 20071. But in any event, it was a return to sort of old ways of providing information. But I think that the problem is that there are ingrained habits among people, and the ingrained habits are to use email. I think people feel very comfortable with that. But I do think if there are more leak investigations and more concerns about hacking, I suspect that people are going to be much more careful about how they communicate.
Good. Just one more. Yeah.
Hi, I'm James Hoyt, and I'm about to graduate from the University of Kansas, majoring in journalism. And I just find it kind of bewildering, going back home and talking to people. And there's been fantastic reporting out there about, taxes, Michael Flynn's connections to Russia, stuff like that. And it's just been kind of bewildering talking to people and just hearing that they don't care. and that, you know, it seems like shiny objects are being thrown out all the time by this administration that bury this stuff. So I guess my question is, what's it going to take to get a story to stick and to not get knocked off, not to get knocked off, you know, prime time by like a feud with Arnold Schwarzenegger or something?
Oh, you know, I don't know. Should I take that? I don't know, actually. I mean, I'm going to get a flavor of that. I'm speaking at Kansas State in April, so and I'm sure it'll be interesting to hear what kinds of questions I get, especially since I'm supposed to talk about ethics in journalism. So, you know, I think these things do stick in some ways. I think we have to, you know, we have to take the long view. Not to make a comparison with the present day, but I mean, Watergate, the investigation was underway and Nixon got reelected. It took a long time. I mean, it was years. It was not something that happened instantaneously. I think there's a tendency these days to expect that story appears, has immediate impact, people immediately do an investigation, and we wrap this up within a few weeks, that sort of thing. That just doesn't happen. I mean, look, when Trump went into office, he had, according to the polls, the lowest approval rating of, I think, any president ever who upon entering office. His approval rating has declined. I mean, I think that, you know, that a lot of that's a reflection of things that he himself has done, has nothing to do with the press. But I think that things have an impact over a longer period of time. And, you know, our job in the press is just to provide information that people need and deserve to know. And they make their decision. And, you know, they're entitled to. We have democracy. They should be the ones to make the decision. And I have absolute respect for that process. It's the same democracy that allows us in the press to do our jobs, to publish what we think we should publish. And you know, we have a system that works in its own ways. It's not a straight line always. And I think we don't know quite what the impact is of what we're publishing, sometimes for years.
So I have been sort of thinking about this in a slightly different context, being sort of coming from the intelligence community and hearing the way that the administration talks about the intelligence community and talks about some of the facts, sort of a similar kind of sense of bewilderment. And one thing that I think is a sort of a really striking thing within the intelligence community is whenever you walk into the CIA, and sort of in marble engraved on the wall, it says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And that is really a motto of that particular community. And I think it is actually an article of faith that exists that actually binds the intelligence community and parts of law enforcement and the press. Just sort of this faith that the truth matters, expertise matters, and sort of being able to have the faith to be a really, really tenacious reporter or a really, really tenacious intelligence agent, someone who just sets yourself to finding the truth, no matter whether it supports your political views or not, or is helpful, or what its impact might be. And so to the extent that I have sort of hope moving forward, it's that I see that in a lot of different places, and I think that something about this moment has really activated that sense in people and inspired you know, young people to enter journalism, young people to enter intelligence, and that's sort of I think it's the one thing that Americans share, and it's the way we're going to have to find our way through, you know, whatever this next period is going to look like.
I do think, I mean, it would be great if out of all that's happening these days, that we as a society, whether it's people in the press, people in government, or people who are ordinary citizens, rededicated themselves to the value of evidence, the value of expertise, and the value of experience.
Well said. We at Georgetown have been so lucky to have you three join us today. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Sorry, we went over a few minutes. So. Okay, great. Are you guys able to? Oh. Lunch here, if you're willing or able to join us, we'd love to have you. That will last until the next panel, which starts in about an hour and a half. So thank you.
Got another one?